Are you searching for the best in online black radio? Then go to blacktalkradionetwork.com, helping you filter through the noise. Real talk, black talk.
But my main aim, I'm sorry I'm going around in circles, but my main aim was that once people leave the cinema, leave the theater and exit out into the street, they have an idea or a sense of what certain people and what we as ourselves have gone through.
This is a list of goods and sundries. You will take it to be filled and returned immediately. Take your tag. Tell Bartholomew to add it to our debt.
Yes, mistress.
Where are you from, Platt?
I told you.
Tell me again.
Washington.
Who were your master?
Master named of Freeman.
Was he a learned man?
I suppose so.
He learned you to read?
A word, here or there. But I've no understanding of the written text.
Don't trouble yourself with it. Same as the rest. Master brought you here to work, that's all. Any more will earn you 100 lashes.
The cinematography on this project is absolutely beautiful to behold, Steve. And I wondered whether or not when people got a chance to see it, they would think that it was too much. That is to say, whether or not the imagery was too much in their face, whether or not you stayed on certain shots too long. Of course, these are all your artistic choices. But since the movie opened last week, and I've had a chance to talk to a lot of people, and I've gotten some responses. But give me your sense as to why you shot it the way you did. For example, when you talk about some scenes, the scene where Patsy is being beaten, or the scene where Solomon is almost hung. I mean, there's some powerful scenes here, but you stay on these shots. You don't let the audience off the hook. We are forced to stay right there, lash by lash, moment by moment. Give me some sense of why you decided to shoot that way.
Well, for me, for example, the lynching, I mean, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of men, women, children were lynched. And I wanted that image to be the lynching of all lynchings. I wanted it to be a situation where people saw that image and obviously, look at that and saw those hundreds and thousands of people who were lynched. It had to be like that. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing my job. For me, I thought to myself, well, either I make a movie about slavery or I don't. I opted to make a film about slavery, similar to the lashes that were on Patsy's back. It's not for me to shy away from things like that as an artist. As an artist, you have to have the courage and conviction to do what you think is right. We have to show these things. These things actually happened, and these things link back. I mean, as a child, I got beaten by my mother and my father with a belt. Where do you think that comes from? That comes from slavery. I know a lot of African American, a lot of West Indian people were beaten with belts. We all know this. Something that we don't talk about because it links back to slavery. We joke about it, laugh about it now, but it has an effect. So for me to sort of not do my job in the best way I can, for me to not tell the truth, and to present those images in the way that I wanted to, would not be doing my job correctly and not be doing a service to my ancestors and to people who have survived and thrived today from slavery.
Context of White Supremacy. Justice Gus T Renegade in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information on the system of white supremacy. Today's date, Friday, November 15th, 2013. So I have been told. That was Smiley and West, featuring Steve McQueen, director of 12 Years a Slave. This is our second week doing our book study session on the book. We are starting on chapter 6. We will definitely make some comparisons to the film, but really want to make sure we're keeping in mind why are white people so focused on the film and the book. How does this benefit the system of white supremacy? We will go ahead and get started. Chapter 6, Solomon Northrup, 12 Years a Slave.
Chapter 6. The very amiable, pious-hearted Mr. Theophilus Freeman, partner or consignee of James H. Birch and keeper of the slave pen in New Orleans, was out among his animals early in the morning. With an occasional kick of the older men and women, and many a sharp crack of the whip about the ears of the younger slaves, it was not long before they were all astir and wide awake. Mr. Theophilus Freeman bustled about in a very industrious manner, getting his property ready for the sales room, intending, no doubt, to do that day a rousing business. In the first place, we were required to wash thoroughly, and those with beards to shave. We were then furnished with a new suit each, cheap but clean. The men had hat, coat, shirt, pants, and shoes. The women frocks of calico, and handkerchiefs to bind about their heads. We were now conducted into a large room in the front of the building, to which the yard was attached, in order to be properly trained before the admission of customers. The men were arranged on one side of the room, the women on the other. The tallest was placed at the head of the row, then the next tallest, and so on in the order of their respective heights. Emily was at the foot of the line of women. Freeman charged us to remember our places, exhorted us to appear smart and lively, sometimes threatening, and again holding out various inducements. During the day he exercised us in the art of looking smart, and of moving to our places with exact precision. After being fed, in the afternoon we were again paraded and made to dance. Bob, a colored boy who had some time belonged to Freeman, played on the violin. Standing near him, I made bold to inquire if he could play the Virginia Reel. He answered he could not, and asked me if I could play. Replying in the affirmative, he handed me the violin. I struck up a tune and finished it. Freeman ordered me to continue playing, and seemed well pleased, telling Bob that I far excelled him, a remark that seemed to grieve my musical companion very much. Next day many customers called to examine Freeman's new lot. The latter gentleman was very loquacious, dwelling at much length upon our several good points and qualities. He would make us hold up our heads, walk briskly back and forth, while customers would feel of our hands and arms and bodies, turn us about, ask us what we could do, make us open our mouths and show our teeth, precisely as a jockey examines a horse which he is about to barter for or purchase. Sometimes a man or woman was taken back to the small house in the yard, stripped and inspected more minutely. Scars upon a slave's back were considered evidence of a rebellious or unruly spirit, and hurt his sale. One old gentleman, who said he wanted a coachman, appeared to take a fancy to me. From his conversation with Birch, I learned he was a resident in the city. I very much desired that he would buy me, because I conceived it would not be difficult to make my escape from New Orleans on some northern vessel. Freeman asked him $1,500 for me. The old gentleman insisted it was too much, as times were very hard. Freeman, however, declared that I was sound and healthy, of a good constitution, and intelligent. He made it a point to enlarge upon my musical attainments. The old gentleman argued quite adroitly that there was nothing extraordinary about the nigger, and finally, to my regret, went out, saying he would call again. During the day, however, a number of sales were made. David and Caroline were purchased together by a Natchez planter. They left us, grinning broadly, and in the most happy state of mind, caused by the fact of their not being separated. Lethe was sold to a planter of Baton Rouge, her eyes flashing with anger as she was led away. The same man also purchased Randall. The little fellow was made to jump and run across the floor and perform many other feats, exhibiting his activity and condition. All the time the trade was going on, Eliza was crying aloud and wringing her hands. She besought the man not to buy him unless he also bought herself and Emily. She promised in that case to be the most faithful slave that ever lived. The man answered that he could not afford it, and then Eliza burst into a paroxysm of grief, weeping plaintively. Freeman turned round to her, savagely, with his whip in his uplifted hand, ordering her to stop her noise, or he would flog her. He would not have such work, such sniveling. And unless she ceased that minute, he would take her to the yard and give her 100 lashes. Yes, he would take the nonsense out of her pretty quick. If he didn't, might he be damned. Eliza shrunk before him and tried to wipe away her tears, but it was all in vain. She wanted to be with her children, she said, the little time she had to live. All the frowns and threats of Freeman could not wholly silence the afflicted mother. She kept on begging and beseeching them most piteously not to separate the three. Over and over again she told them how she loved her boy. A great many times she repeated her former promises, how very faithful and obedient she would be, how hard she would labor day and night to the last moment of her life, if he would only buy them all together. But it was of no avail. The man could not afford it. The bargain was agreed upon, and Randall must go alone. Then Eliza ran to him, embraced him passionately, kissed him again and again, told him to remember her, all the while her tears falling in the boy's face like rain. Freeman damned her, calling her a blubbering, bawling wench, and ordered her to go to her place, and behave herself, and be somebody. He swore he wouldn't stand such stuff but a little longer. He would soon give her something to cry about if she was not mighty careful, and that she might depend upon. The planter from Baton Rouge, with his new purchases, was ready to depart. "Don't cry, Mama. I will be a good boy. Don't cry," said Randall, looking back as they passed out of the door. What has become of the lad, God knows. It was a mournful scene indeed. I would have cried myself if I had dared. That night, nearly all who came in on the brig Orleans were taken ill. They complained of violent pain in the head and back. Little Emily, a thing unusual with her, cried constantly. In the morning a physician was called in, but was unable to determine the nature of our complaint. While examining me and asking questions touching my symptoms, I gave it as my opinion that it was an attack of smallpox, mentioning the fact of Robert's death as the reason of my belief. It might be so indeed, he thought, and he would send for the head physician of the hospital. Shortly, the head physician came, a small, light-haired man whom they called Dr. Carr. He pronounced it smallpox, whereupon there was much alarm throughout the yard. Soon after Dr. Carr left, Eliza, Emmy, Harry, and myself were put into a hack and driven to the hospital, a large white marble building standing on the outskirts of the city. Harry and I were placed in a room in one of the upper stories. I became very sick. For 3 days I was entirely blind. While lying in this state one day, Bob came in, saying to Dr. Carr that Freeman had sent him over to inquire how we were getting on. "Tell him," said the doctor, "that Platt is very bad, but that if he survives until 9 o'clock, he may recover." I expected to die. Though there was little in the prospect before me worth living for, the near approach of death appalled me. I thought I could have been resigned to yield up my life in the bosom of my family, but to expire in the midst of strangers under such circumstances was a bitter reflection. There were a great number in the hospital, of both sexes and of all ages. In the rear of the building coffins were manufactured. When one died, the bell tolled, a signal to the undertaker to come and bear away the body to the potter's field. Many times, each day and night, the tolling bell sent forth its melancholy voice, announcing another death, but my time had not yet come. The crisis having passed, I began to revive, and at the end of 2 weeks and 2 days returned with Harry to the pen, bearing upon my face the effects of the malady, which to this day continues to disfigure it. Eliza and Emily were also brought back next day in a hack, and again we were paraded in the salesroom for the inspection and examination of purchasers. I still indulged the hope that the old gentleman in search of a coachman would call again, as he had promised, and purchase me. In that event I felt an abiding confidence that I would soon regain my liberty. Customer after customer entered, but the old gentleman never made his appearance. At length, one day, while we were in the yard, Freeman came out and ordered us to our places in the great room. A gentleman was waiting for us as we entered, and inasmuch as he will be often mentioned in the progress of this narrative, a description of his personal appearance and my estimation of his character at first sight may not be out of place. He was a man above the ordinary height, somewhat bent and stooping forward. He was a good-looking man, and appeared to have reached about the middle age of life. There was nothing repulsive in his presence. But on the other hand, there was something cheerful and attractive in his face, and in his tone of voice. The finer elements were all kindly mingled in his breast, as anyone could see. He moved about among us, asking many questions as to what we could do and what labor we had been accustomed to, if we thought we would like to live with him, and would be good boys if he would buy us, and other interrogatories of like character. After some further inspection and conversation touching prices, he finally offered Freeman $1,000 for me, $900 for Harry, and $700 for Eliza. Whether the smallpox had depreciated our value, or from what cause Freeman had concluded to fall $500 from the price I was before held at, I cannot say. At any rate, after a little shrewd reflection, he announced his acceptance of the offer. As soon as Eliza heard it, she was in an agony again. By this time she had become haggard and hollow-eyed with sickness and with sorrow. It would be a relief if I could consistently pass over in silence the scene that now ensued. It recalls memories more mournful and affecting than any language can portray. I have seen mothers kissing for the last time the faces of their dead offspring. I have seen them looking down into the grave, as the earth fell with a dull sound upon their coffins, hiding them from their eyes forever. But never have I seen such an exhibition of intense, unmeasured, and unbounded grief as when Eliza was parted from her child. She broke from her place in the line of women, and rushing down where Emily was standing, caught her in her arms. The child, sensible of some impending danger, instinctively fastened her hands around her mother's neck, and nestled her little head upon her bosom. Freeman sternly ordered her to be quiet, but she did not heed him. He caught her by the arm and pulled her rudely, but she only clung the closer to the child. Then, with a volley of great oaths, he struck her such a heartless blow that she staggered backward and was like to fall. Oh, how piteously then did she beseech and beg and pray that they might not be separated. Why could they not be purchased together? Why not let her have one of her dear children? "Mercy, mercy, master," she cried, falling on her knees. "Please, master, buy Emily. I can never work any if she is taken from me. I will die." Freeman interfered again, but disregarding him, she still pled most earnestly, telling how Randall had been taken from her, how she never see him again, and now it was too bad. Oh, God, it was too bad, too cruel to take her away from Emily. Her pride, her only darling, that could not live, it was so young, without its mother. Finally, after much more of supplication, the purchaser of Eliza stepped forward, evidently affected, and said to Freeman he would buy Emily, and asked him what her price was. "What is her price? Buy her?" was the responsive interrogatory of Theophilus Freeman, and instantly answering his own inquiry, he added, "I won't sell her. She's not for sale." The man remarked he was not in need of one so young, that it would be of no profit to him, but since the mother was so fond of her, rather than see them separated, he would pay a reasonable price. But to this humane proposal Freeman was entirely deaf. He would not sell her then on any account whatever. There were heaps and piles of money to be made of her, he said, when she was a few years older. There were men enough in New Orleans who would give $5,000 for such an extra, handsome, fancy piece as Emily would be, rather than not get her. No, he would not sell her then. She was a beauty, a picture, a doll, one of the regular bloods, none of your thick-lipped, bullet-headed, cotton-picking niggers. If she was, might he be damned. When Eliza heard Freeman's determination not to part with Emily, she became absolutely frantic. "I will not go without her. They shall not take her from me," she fairly shrieked, her shrieks commingling with the loud and angry voice of Freeman, commanding her to be silent. Meantime, Harry and myself had been to the yard and returned with our blankets, and were at the front door ready to leave. Our purchaser stood near us, gazing at Eliza with an expression indicative of regret at having bought her at the expense of so much sorrow. We waited some time, when, finally, Freeman, out of patience, tore Emily from her mother by main force, the two clinging to each other with all their might. "Don't leave me, Mamma, don't leave me!" screamed the child, as its mother was pushed harshly forward. "Don't leave me! Come back, Mamma!" she still cried, stretching forth her little arms imploringly, but she cried in vain. Out of the door and into the street we were quickly hurried. Still we could hear her calling to her mother, "Come back! Don't leave me! Come back, Mamma!" until her infant voice grew faint and still more faint, and gradually died away as distance intervened, and finally was wholly lost. Eliza never after saw or heard of Emily or Randall. Day nor night, however, were they ever absent from her memory. In the cotton field, in the cabin, always and everywhere she was talking of them, often to them, as if they were actually present. Only when absorbed in that illusion, or sleep, did she ever have a moment's comfort afterwards. She was no common slave, as has been said. To a large share of natural intelligence which she possessed was added a general knowledge and information on most subjects. She had enjoyed opportunities such as are afforded to very few of her oppressed class. She had been lifted up into the regions of a higher life. Freedom for herself and for her offspring, for many years had been her cloud by day, her pillar of fire by night. In her pilgrimage through the wilderness of bondage, with eyes fixed upon that hope-inspiring beacon, she had at length ascended to the top of Pisgah and beheld the land of promise. In an unexpected moment she was utterly overwhelmed with disappointment and despair. The glorious vision of liberty faded from her sight as they led her away into captivity. Now she weepeth sore in the night, and tears are on her cheeks. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. Chapter 7. On leaving the New Orleans slave pen, Harry and I followed our new master through the streets, while Eliza, crying and turning back, was forced along by Freeman and his minions until we found ourselves on board the steamboat Rudolph, then lying at the levee. In the course of half an hour we were moving briskly up the Mississippi, bound for some point on Red River. There were quite a number of slaves on board beside ourselves, just purchased in the New Orleans market. I remember a Mr. Kelso, who was said to be a well-known and extensive planter, had in charge a gang of women. Our master's name was William Ford. He resided then in the Great Pine Woods, in the parish of Avoyelles, situated on the right bank of Red River, in the heart of Louisiana. He is now a Baptist preacher. Throughout the whole parish of Avoyelles, and especially along both shores of Bayou Boeuf, where he is more intimately known, he is accounted by his fellow citizens as a worthy minister of God. In many northern minds, perhaps, the idea of a man holding his brother man in servitude, and the traffic in human flesh, may seem altogether incompatible with their conceptions of a moral or religious life. From descriptions of such men as Birch and Freeman, and others hereinafter mentioned, they are led to despise and execrate the whole class of slaveholders indiscriminately. But I was sometime his slave, and had an opportunity of learning well his character and disposition, and it is but simple justice to him when I say, in my opinion, there never was a more kind, noble, candid Christian man than William Ford. The influences and associations that had always surrounded him blinded him to the inherent wrong at the bottom of the system of slavery. He never doubted the moral right of one man holding another in subjection. Looking through the same medium with his fathers before him, he saw things in the same light. Brought up under other circumstances and other influences, his notions would undoubtedly have been different. Nevertheless, he was a model master, walking uprightly, according to the light of his understanding, and fortunate was the slave who came to his possession. Were all men such as he, slavery would be deprived of more than half its bitterness. We were 2 days and 3 nights on board the steamboat Rudolph, during which time nothing of particular interest occurred. I was now known as Platt, the name given me by Birch, and by which I was designated through the whole period of my servitude. Eliza was sold by the name of Drady. She was so distinguished in the conveyance to Ford, now on record in the recorder's office in New Orleans. On our passage I was constantly reflecting on my situation, and consulting with myself on the best course to pursue in order to effect my ultimate escape. Sometimes, not only then but afterwards, I was almost on the point of disclosing fully to Ford the facts of my history. I am inclined now to the opinion it would have resulted in my benefit. This course was often considered, but through fear of its miscarriage never put into execution, until eventually my transfer and his pecuniary embarrassments rendered it evidently unsafe. Afterwards, under other masters, unlike William Ford, I knew well enough the slightest knowledge of my real character would consign me at once to the remoter depths of slavery. I was too costly a chattel to be lost, and was well aware that I would be taken farther on, into some by-place, over the Texan border perhaps, and sold. That I would be disposed of as the thief disposes of his stolen horse, if my right to freedom was even whispered. So I resolved to lock the secret closely in my heart, never to utter one word or syllable as to who or what I was, trusting in Providence and my own shrewdness for deliverance. At length we left the steamboat Rudolph at a place called Alexandria, several hundred miles from New Orleans. It is a small town on the southern shore of Red River. Having remained there overnight, we entered the morning train of cars, and were soon at Bayou La Marie, a still smaller place, distant 18 miles from Alexandria. At that time, it was the termination of the railroad. Ford's plantation was situated on the Texas Road, 12 miles from La Marie, in the Great Pine Woods. This distance, it was announced to us, must be traveled on foot, there being public conveyances no farther. Accordingly, we all set out in the company of Ford. It was an excessively hot day. Harry, Eliza, and myself were yet weak, and the bottoms of our feet were very tender from the effects of the smallpox. We proceeded slowly, Ford telling us to take our time and sit down and rest whenever we desired, a privilege that was taken advantage of quite frequently. After leaving La Marie and crossing 2 plantations, one belonging to Mr. Carnell, the other to a Mr. Flint, we reached the Pine Woods, a wilderness that stretches to the Sabine River. The whole country about Red River is low and marshy. The Pine Woods, as they are called, is comparatively upland, with frequent small intervals, however, running through them. This upland is covered with numerous trees, the white oak, the chinkapin, resembling chestnut, but principally the yellow pine. They are of great size, running up 60 feet, and perfectly straight. The woods were full of cattle, very shy and wild, dashing away in herds, with a loud snuff at our approach. Some of them were marked or branded, the rest appeared to be in their wild and untamed state. They are much smaller than northern breeds, and the peculiarity about them that most attracted my attention was their horns. They stand out from the sides of the head precisely straight, like 2 iron spikes. At noon we reached a cleared piece of ground containing 3 or 4 acres. Upon it was a small, unpainted wooden house, a corn crib, or, as we would say, a barn, and a log kitchen, standing about a rod from the house. It was the summer residence of Mr. Martin. Rich planters, having large establishments on Bayou Buff, are accustomed to spend the warmer season in these woods. Here they find clear water and delightful shades. In fact, these retreats are to the planters of that section of the country what Newport and Saratoga are to the wealthier inhabitants of northern cities. We were sent around into the kitchen and supplied with sweet potatoes, cornbread, and bacon, while Master Ford dined with Martin in the house. There were several slaves about the premises. Martin came out and took a look at us, asking Ford the price of each, if we were green hands, and so forth, and making inquiries in relation to the slave market generally. After a long rest, we set forth again, following the Texas road, which had the appearance of being very rarely traveled. For 5 miles we passed through continuous woods without observing a single habitation. At length, just as the sun was sinking in the west, we entered another opening, containing some 12 or 15 acres. In this opening stood a house much larger than Mr. Martin's. It was 2 stories high, with a piazza in front. In the rear of it was also a log kitchen, poultry house, corn cribs, and several Negro cabins. Near the house was a peach orchard, and gardens of orange and pomegranate trees. The space was entirely surrounded by woods and covered with a carpet of rich, rank verdure. It was a quiet, lonely, pleasant place, literally a green spot in the wilderness. It was the residence of my master, William Ford. As we approached, a yellow girl, her name was Rose, was standing on the piazza. Going to the door, she called her mistress, who presently came running out to meet her lord. She kissed him, and laughingly demanded if he had bought those niggers. Ford said he had, and told us to go round to Sally's cabin and rest ourselves. Turning the corner of the house, we discovered Sally washing, her 2 baby children near her, rolling on the grass. They jumped up and toddled towards us, looked at us a moment like a brace of rabbits, then ran back to their mother as if afraid of us. Sally conducted us into the cabin, told us to lay down our bundles and be seated, for she was sure that we were tired. Just then John, the cook, a boy some 16 years of age, and blacker than any crow, came running in, looked steadily in our faces, then turning round, without saying as much as, "How do you do?" ran back to the kitchen, laughing loudly, as if our coming was a great joke indeed. Much wearied with our walk, as soon as it was dark, Harry and I wrapped our blankets round us and laid down upon the cabin floor. My thoughts, as usual, wandered back to my wife and children. The consciousness of my real situation, the hopelessness of any effort to escape through the wide forests of Avoyelles, pressed heavily upon me, yet my heart was at home in Saratoga. I was awakened early in the morning by the voice of Master Ford, calling Rose. She hastened into the house to dress the children, Sally to the field to milk the cows, while John was busy in the kitchen preparing breakfast. In the meantime, Harry and I were strolling about the yard, looking at our new quarters. Just after breakfast, a colored man, driving 3 yoke of oxen, attached to a wagon-load of lumber, drove into the opening. He was a slave of Ford's, named Walton, the husband of Rose. By the way, Rose was a native of Washington, and had been brought from thence 5 years before. She had never seen Eliza, but she had heard of Barry, and they knew the same streets, and the same people, either personally or by reputation. They became fast friends immediately, and talked a great deal together of old times, and of friends they had left behind. Ford was at that time a wealthy man. Besides his seat in the pine woods, he owned a large lumbering establishment on Indian Creek, 4 miles distant, and also, in his wife's right, an extensive plantation and many slaves on Bayou Buff. Walton had come with his load of lumber from the mills on Indian Creek. Ford directed us to return with him, saying he would follow us as soon as possible. Before leaving, Mistress Ford called me into the storeroom, and handed me, as it is there termed, a tin bucket of molasses for Harry and myself. Eliza was still wringing her hands and deploring the loss of her children. Ford tried as much as possible to console her, told her she need not work very hard, that she might remain with Rose and assist the madam in the house affairs. Riding with Walton in the wagon, Harry and I became quite well acquainted with him long before reaching Indian Creek. He was a born thrall of Ford's, and spoke kindly and affectionately of him, as a child would speak of his own father. In answer to his inquiries from whence I came, I told him from Washington. Of that city he had heard much from his wife, Rose, and all the way plied me with many extravagant and absurd questions. On reaching the mills at Indian Creek, we found 2 more of Ford's slaves, Sam and Antony. Sam also was a Washingtonian, having been brought out in the same gang with Rose. He had worked on a farm near Georgetown. Antony was a blacksmith from Kentucky, who had been in his present master's service about 10 years. Sam knew Birch, and when informed that he was the traitor who had sent me on from Washington, it was remarkable how well we agreed upon the subject of his superlative rascality. He had forwarded Sam also. On Ford's arrival at the mill, we were employed in piling lumber and chopping logs, which occupation we continued during the remainder of the summer. We usually spent our Sabbaths at the opening, on which days our master would gather all his slaves about him and read and expound the Scriptures. He sought to inculcate in our minds feelings of kindness towards each other, of dependence upon God, setting forth the rewards promised unto those who lead an upright and prayerful life. Seated in the doorway of his house, surrounded by his manservants and his maidservants, who looked earnestly into the good man's face, he spoke of the loving kindness of the Creator, and of the life that is to come. Often did the voice of prayer ascend from his lips to heaven, the only sound that broke the solitude of the place. In the course of the summer, Sam became deeply convicted, his mind dwelling intensely on the subject of religion. His mistress gave him a Bible, which he carried with him to his work. Whatever leisure time was allowed him, he spent in perusing it, though it was only with great difficulty that he could master any part of it. I often read to him, a favor which he well repaid me by many expressions of gratitude. Sam's piety was frequently observed by white men who came to the mill, and the remark it most generally provoked was that a man like Ford, who allowed his slaves to have Bibles, was not fit to own a nigger. He, however, lost nothing by his kindness. It is a fact I have more than once observed that those who treated their slaves most leniently were rewarded by the greatest amount of labor. I know it from my own experience. It was a source of pleasure to surprise Master Ford with a greater day's work than was required, while, under subsequent masters, there was no prompter to extra effort but the overseer's lash. It was the desire of Ford's approving voice that suggested to me an idea that resulted to his profit. The lumber we were manufacturing was contracted to be delivered at La Marie. It had hitherto been transported by land, and was an important item of expense. Indian Creek, upon which the mills were situated, was a narrow but deep stream emptying into Bayou Buff. In some places it was not more than 12 feet wide, and much obstructed with trunks of trees. Bayou Buff was connected with Bayou La Marie. I ascertained the distance from the mills to the point on the latter bayou, where our lumber was to be delivered, was but a few miles less by land than by water. Provided the creek could be made navigable for rafts, it occurred to me that the expense of transportation would be materially diminished. Adam Tatum, a little white man who had been a soldier in Florida and had strolled into that distant region, was foreman and superintendent of the mills. He scouted the idea, but Ford, when I laid it before him, received it favorably and permitted me to try the experiment. Having removed the obstructions, I made up a narrow raft consisting of 12 cribs. At this business I think I was quite skillful, not having forgotten my experience years before on the Champlain Canal. I labored hard, being extremely anxious to succeed, both from a desire to please my master and to show Adam Tatum that my scheme was not such a visionary one as he incessantly pronounced it. One hand could manage 3 cribs. I took charge of the forward 3 and commenced poling down the creek. In due time we entered the first bayou, and finally reached our destination in a shorter period of time than I had anticipated. The arrival of the raft at La Marie created a sensation, while Mr. Ford loaded me with commendation. On all sides I heard Ford's Platte pronounced the smartest nigger in the pine woods. In fact, I was the Fulton of Indian Creek. I was not insensible to the praise bestowed upon me, and enjoyed especially my triumph over Tatum, whose half-malicious ridicule had stung my pride. From this time, the entire control of bringing the lumber to La Marie was placed in my hands until the contract was fulfilled. Indian Creek, in its whole length, flows through a magnificent forest. There dwells on its shore a tribe of Indians, a remnant of the Chickasaws or Chickapees, if I remember rightly. They live in simple huts, 10 or 12 feet square, constructed of pine poles and covered with bark. They subsist principally on the flesh of the deer, the coon, and opossum, all of which are plenty in these woods. Sometimes they exchange venison for a little corn and whiskey with the planters on the bayous. Their usual dress is buckskin breeches and calico hunting shirts of fantastic colors, buttoned from belt to chin. They wear brass rings on their wrists and in their ears and noses. The dress of the squaws is very similar. They are fond of dogs and horses, owning many of the latter, of a small, tough breed, and are skillful riders. Their bridles, girths, and saddles were made of raw skins of animals, their stirrups of a certain kind of wood. Mounted astride their ponies, men and women, I have seen them dash out into the woods at the utmost of their speed, following narrow, winding paths and dodging trees in a manner that eclipsed the most miraculous feats of civilized equestrianism. Circling away in various directions, the forest echoing and re-echoing with their whoops, they would presently return at the same dashing, headlong speed with which they started. Their village was on Indian Creek, known as Indian Castle, but their range extended to the Sabine River. Occasionally a tribe from Texas would come over on a visit, and then there was indeed a carnival in the Great Pine Woods. Chief of the tribe was Cascala, second in rank, John Baltese, his son-in-law, with both of whom, as with many others of the tribe, I became acquainted during my frequent voyages down the creek with rafts. Sam and myself would often visit them when the day's task was done. They were obedient to the chief. The word of Cascala was their law. They were a rude but harmless people and enjoyed their wild mode of life. They had little fancy for the open country, the cleared lands on the shores of the bayous, but preferred to hide themselves within the shadows of the forest. They worshipped the Great Spirit, loved whiskey, and were happy. On one occasion I was present at a dance when a roving herd from Texas had encamped in their village. The entire carcass of a deer was roasting before a large fire, which threw its light a long distance among the trees under which they were assembled. When they had formed in a ring, men and squaws alternately, a sort of Indian fiddle set up an indescribable tune. It was a continuous, melancholy kind of wavy sound, with the slightest possible variation. At the first note, if indeed there was more than one note in the whole tune, they circled around, trotting after each other and giving utterance to a guttural, sing-song noise, equally as nondescript as the music of the fiddle. At the end of the third circuit, they would stop suddenly, whoop as if their lungs would crack, then break from the ring, forming in couples, man and squaw, each jumping backwards as far as possible from the other, then forwards, which graceful feat having been twice or thrice accomplished, they would form in a ring, and go trotting round again. The best dancer appeared to be considered the one who could whoop the loudest, jump the farthest, and utter the most excruciating noise. At intervals, one or more would leave the dancing circle, and going to the fire, cut from the roasting carcass a slice of venison. In a hole shaped like a mortar, cut in the trunk of a fallen tree, they pounded corn with a wooden pestle, and of the meal made cake. Alternately they danced and ate. Thus were the visitors from Texas entertained by the dusky sons and daughters of the Chickapees, and such is a description, as I saw it, of an Indian ball in the pine woods of Avoyelles. In the autumn I left the mills, and was employed at the opening. One day the mistress was urging Ford to procure a loom, in order that Sally might commence weaving cloth for the winter garments of the slaves. He could not imagine where one was to be found, when I suggested that the easiest way to get one would be to make it, informing him at the same time that I was a sort of jack at all trades, and would attempt it with his permission. It was granted very readily, and I was allowed to go to a neighboring planter's to inspect one before commencing the undertaking. At length it was finished, and pronounced by Sally to be perfect. She could easily weave her task of 14 yards, milk the cows, and have leisure time besides each day. It worked so well, I was continued in the employment of making looms, which were taken down to the plantation on the bayou. At this time, one John M. Tibeats, a carpenter, came to the opening to do some work on master's house. I was directed to quit the looms and assist him. For 2 weeks I was in his company, planing and matching boards for ceiling, a plastered room being a rare thing in the parish of Avoyelles. John M. Tibeats was the opposite of Ford in all respects. He was a small, crabbed, quick-tempered, spiteful man. He had no fixed residence that I ever heard of, but passed from one plantation to another, wherever he could find employment. He was without standing in the community, not esteemed by white men, nor even respected by slaves. He was ignorant, withal, and of a revengeful disposition. He left the parish long before I did, and I know not whether he is at present alive or dead. Certain it is, it was a most unlucky day for me that brought us together. During my residence with Master Ford, I had seen only the bright side of slavery. His was no heavy hand crushing us to the earth. He pointed upwards, and with benign and cheering words addressed us as his fellow mortals, accountable, like himself, to the Maker of us all. I think of him with affection, and had my family been with me, could have borne his gentle servitude, without murmuring, all my days. But clouds were gathering in the horizon, forerunners of a pitiless storm that was soon to break over me. I was doomed to endure such bitter trials as the poor slave only knows, and to lead no more the comparatively happy life which I had led in the great pine woods. Chapter 8. William Ford unfortunately became embarrassed in his pecuniary affairs. A heavy judgment was rendered against him in consequence of his having become security for his brother, Franklin Ford, residing on Red River above Alexandria, and who had failed to meet his liabilities. He was also indebted to John M. Tibeats to a considerable amount in consideration of his services in building the mills on Indian Creek, and also a weaving house, corn mill, and other erections on the plantation at Bayou Boeuf, not yet completed. It was therefore necessary, in order to meet these demands, to dispose of 18 slaves, myself among the number. 17 of them, including Sam and Harry, were purchased by Peter Compton, a planter also residing on Red River. I was sold to Tibeats, in consequence, undoubtedly, of my slight skill as a carpenter. This was in the winter of 1842. The deed of myself from Freeman to Ford, as I ascertained from the public records in New Orleans on my return, was dated June 23, 1841. At the time of my sale to Tibeats, the price agreed to be given for me being more than the debt. Ford took a chattel mortgage of $400. I am indebted for my life, as will hereafter be seen, to that mortgage. I bade farewell to my good friends at the opening, and departed with my new master, Tibeats. We went down to the plantation on Bayou Buff, distant 27 miles from the pine woods, to complete the unfinished contract. Bayou Buff is a sluggish, winding stream, one of those stagnant bodies of water common in that region, setting back from Red River. It stretches from a point not far from Alexandria in a southeasterly direction, and following its tortuous course is more than 50 miles in length. Large cotton and sugar plantations line each shore, extending back to the borders of interminable swamps. It is alive with alligators, rendering it unsafe for swine or unthinking slave children to stroll along its banks. Upon a bend in this bayou, a short distance from Cheneyville, was situated the plantation of Madame Ford, her brother, Peter Tanner, a great landholder living on the opposite side. On my arrival at Bayou Buff, I had the pleasure of meeting Eliza, whom I had not seen for several months. She had not pleased Mrs. Ford, being more occupied in brooding over her sorrows than in attending to her business, and had in consequence been sent down to work in the field on the plantation. She had grown feeble and emaciated, and was still mourning for her children. She asked me if I had forgotten them, and a great many times inquired if I still remembered how handsome little Emily was, how much Randall loved her, and wondered if they were living still, and where the darlings could then be. She had sunk beneath the weight of an excessive grief. Her drooping form and hollow cheeks too plainly indicated that she had well nigh reached the end of her weary road. Ford's overseer on this plantation, and who had the exclusive charge of it, was a Mr. Chapin, a kindly disposed man, and a native of Pennsylvania. In common with others, he held Tibeats in light estimation, which fact, in connection with the $400 mortgage, was fortunate for me. I was now compelled to labor very hard. From earliest dawn until late at night, I was not allowed to be a moment idle, notwithstanding which Tibeats was never satisfied. He was continually cursing and complaining. He never spoke to me a kind word. I was his faithful slave, and earned him large wages every day, and yet I went to my cabin nightly, loaded with abuse and stinging epithets. We had completed the corn-mill, the kitchen, and so forth, and were at work upon the weaving-house when I was guilty of an act, in that state punishable with death. It was my first fight with Tibeats. The weaving-house we were erecting stood in the orchards a few rods from the residence of Chapin, or the Great House, as it was called. One night, having worked until it was too dark to see, I was ordered by Tibeats to rise very early in the morning, procure a keg of nails from Chapin, and commence putting on the clapboards. I retired to the cabin extremely tired, and having cooked a supper of bacon and corn cake, and conversed a while with Eliza, who occupied the same cabin, as also did Lawson and his wife Mary, and a slave named Bristol laid down upon the ground floor, little dreaming of the sufferings that awaited me on the morrow. Before daylight I was on the piazza of the Great House, awaiting the appearance of Overseer Chapin. To have aroused him from his slumbers and stated my errand would have been an unpardonable boldness. At length he came out. Taking off my hat, I informed him Master Tibeats had directed me to call upon him for a keg of nails. Going into the storeroom, he rolled it out, at the same time saying if Tibeats preferred a different size, he would endeavor to furnish them, but that I might use those until further directed. Then, mounting his horse, which stood saddled and bridled at the door, he rode away into the field. whither the slaves had preceded him, while I took the keg on my shoulder, and proceeding to the weaving house, broke in the head and commenced nailing on the clapboards. As the day began to open, Tibeats came out of the house to where I was, hard at work. He seemed to be that morning even more morose and disagreeable than usual. He was my master, entitled by law to my flesh and blood, and to exercise over me such tyrannical control as his mean nature prompted, but there was no law that could prevent my looking upon him with intense contempt. I despised both his disposition and his intellect. I had just come round to the keg for a further supply of nails as he reached the weaving house. "I thought I told you to commence putting on weatherboards this morning," he remarked. "Yes, master, and I am about it," I replied. "Where?" he demanded. "On the other side," was my answer. He walked round to the other side, examined my work for a while, muttering to himself in a fault-finding tone. "Didn't I tell you last night to get a keg of nails from Chapin?" he broke forth again. "Yes, master, and so I did, and overseer said he would get another size for you if you wanted them, when he came back from the field." Tibeats walked to the keg, looked a moment at the contents, then kicked it violently. Coming towards me in a great passion, he exclaimed, "God damn you, I thought you knowed something." I made answer, "I tried to do as you told me, master. I didn't mean anything wrong. Overseer said—" But he interrupted me with such a flood of curses that I was unable to finish the sentence. At length he ran towards the house, and going to the piazza took down one of the overseer's whips. The whip had a short wooden stock, braided over with leather, and was loaded at the butt. The lash was 3 feet long, or thereabouts, and made of rawhide strands. At first I was somewhat frightened, and my impulse was to run. There was no one about except Rachel, the cook, and Chapin's wife, and neither of them were to be seen. The rest were in the field. I knew he intended to whip me, and it was the first time anyone had attempted it since my arrival at Avoyelles. I felt, moreover, that I had been faithful, that I was guilty of no wrong whatever, and deserved commendation rather than punishment. My fear changed to anger, and before he reached me I had made up my mind fully not to be whipped, let the result be life or death. Winding the lash around his hand, and taking hold of the small end of the stock, he walked up to me, and with a malignant look ordered me to strip. "Master Tibeats," said I, looking him boldly in the face, "I will not." I was about to say something further in justification, but with concentrated vengeance he sprang upon me, seizing me by the throat with one hand, raising the whip with the other, in the act of striking. Before the blow descended, however, I had caught him by the collar of the coat and drawn him closely to me. Reaching down, I seized him by the ankle, and pushing him back with the other hand, he fell over on the ground. Putting one arm around his leg and holding it to my breast so that his head and shoulders only touched the ground, I placed my foot upon his neck. He was completely in my power. My blood was up. It seemed to course through my veins like fire. In the frenzy of my madness, I snatched the whip from his hand. He struggled with all his power, swore that I should not live to see another day, and that he would tear out my heart. But his struggles and his threats were alike in vain. I cannot tell how many times I struck him. Blow after blow fell fast and heavy upon his wriggling form. At length he screamed, cried murder, and at last the blasphemous tyrant called on God for mercy. But he who had never shown mercy did not receive it. The stiff stock of the whip warped round his cringing body until my right arm ached. Until this time I had been too busy to look about me. Desisting for a moment, I saw Mrs. Chapin looking from the window, and Rachel standing in the kitchen door. Their attitudes expressed the utmost excitement and alarm. His screams had been heard in the field. Chapin was coming as fast as he could ride. I struck him a blow or two more, then pushed him from me with such a well-directed kick that he went rolling over on the ground. Rising to his feet and brushing the dirt from his hair, he stood looking at me, pale with rage. We gazed at each other in silence. Not a word was uttered until Chapin galloped up to us. "What's the matter?" he cried out. "Master Tibeats wants to whip me for using the nails you gave me," I replied. "What is the matter with the nails?" he inquired, turning to Tibeats. Tibeats answered to the effect that they were too large, paying little heed, however, to Chapin's question, but still keeping his snakish eyes fastened maliciously on me. "I am overseer here," Chapin began. "I told Platt to take them and use them, and if they were not of the proper size I would get others on returning from the field. It is not his fault. Besides, I shall furnish such nails as I please. I hope you will understand that, Mr. Tibeats." Tibeats made no reply, but grinding his teeth and shaking his fist swore he would have satisfaction, and that it was not half over yet. Thereupon he walked away, followed by the overseer, and entered the house, the latter talking to him all the while in a suppressed tone and with earnest gestures. I remained where I was, doubting whether it was better to fly or abide the result, whatever it might be. Presently Tibeats came out of the house, and, saddling his horse, the only property he possessed besides myself, departed on the road to Cheneyville. When he was gone, Chapin came out, visibly excited, telling me not to stir, not to attempt to leave the plantation on any account whatever. He then went to the kitchen, and calling Rachel out, conversed with her some time. Coming back, he again charged me with great earnestness not to run, saying my master was a rascal, that he had left on no good errand, and that there might be trouble before night. But at all events, he insisted upon it. I must not stir. As I stood there, feelings of unutterable agony overwhelmed me. I was conscious that I had subjected myself to unimaginable punishment. The reaction that followed my extreme ebullition of anger produced the most painful sensations of regret. An unfriended, helpless slave, what could I do, what could I say, to justify, in the remotest manner, the heinous act I had committed, of resenting a white man's contumely and abuse? I tried to pray. I tried to beseech my heavenly Father to sustain me in my sore extremity, but emotion choked my utterance, and I could only bow my head upon my hands and weep. For at least an hour I remained in this situation, finding relief only in tears, when, looking up, I beheld Tibeats, accompanied by 2 horsemen, coming down the bayou. They rode into the yard, jumped from their horses, and approached me with large whips, one of them also carrying a coil of rope. "Cross your hands," commanded Tibeats, with the addition of such a shuddering expression of blasphemy as is not decorous to repeat. "You need not bind me, Master Tibeats. I am ready to go with you anywhere," said I. One of his companions then stepped forward, swearing if I made the least resistance he would break my head, he would tear me limb from limb, he would cut my black throat, and giving wide scope to other similar expressions. Perceiving any importunity altogether vain, I crossed my hands, submitting humbly to whatever disposition they might please to make of me. Thereupon Tibeats tied my wrists, drawing the rope around them with his utmost strength. Then he bound my ankles in the same manner. In the meantime, the other 2 had slipped a cord within my elbows, running it across my back and tying it firmly. It was utterly impossible to move hand or foot. With the remaining piece of rope, Tibeats made an awkward noose and placed it about my neck. "Now then," inquired one of Tibeats' companions, "where shall we hang the nigger?" One proposed such a limb, extending from the body of a peach tree, near the spot where we were standing. His comrade objected to it, alleging it would break, and proposed another. Finally, they fixed upon the latter. During this conversation, and all the time they were binding me, I uttered not a word. Overseer Chapin, during the progress of the scene, was walking hastily back and forth on the piazza. Rachel was crying by the kitchen door, and Mrs. Chapin was still looking from the window. Hope died within my heart. Surely my time had come. I should never behold the light of another day, never behold the faces of my children, the sweet anticipation I had cherished with such fondness. I should that hour struggle through the fearful agonies of death. None would mourn for me, none revenge me. Soon my form would be mouldering in that distant soil, or perhaps be cast to the slimy reptiles that filled the stagnant waters of the bayou. Tears flowed down my cheeks, but they only afforded a subject of insulting comment for my executioners. At length, as they were dragging me towards the tree, Chapin, who had momentarily disappeared from the piazza, came out of the house and walked toward us. He had a pistol in each hand, and as near as I can now recall to mind, spoke in a firm, determined manner, as follows. Gentlemen, I have a few words to say. You had better listen to them. Whoever moves that slave another foot from where he stands is a dead man. In the first place, he does not deserve this treatment. It is a shame to murder him in this manner. I never knew a more faithful boy than Platt. You, Tibeats, are in the fault yourself. You are pretty much of a scoundrel, and I know it, and you richly deserve the flogging you have received. In the next place, I have been overseer on this plantation 7 years, and in the absence of William Ford am master here. My duty is to protect his interests, and that duty I shall perform. You are not responsible. You are a worthless fellow. Ford holds a mortgage on Platt of $400. If you hang him, he loses his debt. Until that is canceled, you have no right to take his life. You have no right to take it anyway. There is a law for the slave as well as for the white man. You are no better than a murderer. As for you, addressing Cook and Ramsey, a couple of overseers from neighboring plantations, as for you, be gone. If you have any regard for your own safety, I say, be gone. Cook and Ramsey, without a further word, mounted their horses and rode away. Tibeats, in a few minutes, evidently in fear, and overawed by the decided tone of Chapin, sneaked off like a coward, as he was, and mounting his horse, followed his companions. I remained standing where I was, still bound, with the rope around my neck. As soon as they were gone, Chapin called Rachel, ordering her to run to the field and tell Lawson to hurry to the house without delay, and bring the brown mule with him, an animal much prized for its unusual fleetness. Presently the boy appeared. "Lawson," said Chapin, "you must go to the pine woods. Tell your master Ford to come here at once, that he must not delay a single moment. Tell him they are trying to murder Platt. Now hurry, boy. Be at the pine woods by noon if you kill the mule." Chapin stepped into the house and wrote a pass. When he returned, Lawson was at the door, mounted on his mule. Receiving the pass, he plied the whip right smartly to the beast, dashed out of the yard, and turning up the bayou on a hard gallop, in less time than it has taken me to describe the scene, was out of sight.
Context of White Supremacy. The number to dial for folks who would like to participate is 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943#. Press *6 if you would like to participate. The number again, 760-569-7676. And the code is 564-943#. Press *6 if you would like to participate. If you do not want to use your phone to dial in, you can use any of the apps for the iPhone or Android. Should be linked on the Black Talk Radio page. We also have the Flash phone you can use. The button should be on the Black Talk Radio page. If you are not listening there, the URL for the Flash phone, which is free, is tiny.cc/1race. The address again, tiny, tiny.cc/1race, and that's the number 1. Once you do that, it will open a small window. On the first line, it's a drop-down menu. Just select the number that I just gave, which is 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943#. Excuse me. Just pick the number 760-569-7676. Then on the second line, put the code in, which is 564-943. Then the third line, you can put in a pseudonym, put in your real name if you please, handle, whatever, nickname, or you can leave it blank. And then just press the green button at the bottom to connect to the program. You should be able to hear clearly once you click the green button. And then if you would like to participate, it's the same procedure as if you use your phone, which is to press *6. You should hear an audio prompt, and then just press the number 1, and I'll get your hand. Be good to go. Wowee. For folks who have seen the film, you'll notice a major deviation in the scene that we just ended on. But again, this is about the book, not necessarily the film. I might ask a few comparison contrast questions for folks who have seen Steve McQueen's film or Gordon Parks' film adaptation of the book. But that's a pretty major deviation, the last scene that we just heard. Anywho, Mr. Demery 4, line should be open, as well as the caller from a blocked number. I'll open up other lines as I see hands.
Greetings, Gus. Can I be heard?
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Demery and the other callers on the line, greetings to you as well. I'm in a state of emotion right now because listening and rereading what happened to Eliza and her children as a mother, I could only imagine what she went through as a result of her children being taken from her and the inhumane treatment that was given to her, especially her daughter, because we already know what happened to that child. That child was more or less taken and put into the sex trade because of the description that he gave of the little girl, how she was pretty. She is so-called, quote, mixed. And in New Orleans, they have what they call passe blanc, where they run these brothels and where these so-called planters, they go and they have relations with these children. You know, that's just, don't even call it relations, because there's no such thing as a relation between a slave and an owner. And that's what these children were trained for in the sex business. And that's where this child ended up. And I feel so heartbroken for this mother to see her son was taken from her. The amount of love that she had for her children and the inhumane, the heartlessness of these people in not even trying. And the man, you know, he already knows, Freeman, he already knew what he was going to do with this child. He already had a plan in his head that he was going to keep her, and he said he was going to get at least $5,000 for her. So he knew what he was going to do with his child, what was going to end up. You know, this was scattered because through this whole narrative, these people were described as chattel. It was like a horse that you just trade. You trade one, you get a better one, and back and forth. And this is so close to home for me and my husband, because this whole episode, this is where he's from. My husband is from central Louisiana, Alexandria, and all of this history where he was talking about where Northrup went through, this is right where he's from, because he was born and raised there. It's called Avoyelles. You said Avoyelles. It's Avoyelles Parish, where this all happened in Marksville, where he ended up. Solomon Northrup, the whole incident with the Ford plantation. His godmother, my husband's godmother, her name is Ford. She came off the Ford plantation, her family. But they spelled it with a different variation. They put an E on the end of the name Ford. Instead of a D, they put an E on it. They're from Bunkie, which is in Avoyelles Parish, where they came from. So all of this is so close and so personal to home for us that, and I never knew, because I never read this book coming along, because I was just never into this plantation fiction. I never read it. I never went through it. But going through this and seeing the movie and seeing this, my husband, he could not believe how close to home all of this was, where all of this imagery with Bayou Boeuf, the Sabine River, all of these things, you know, it's close to home because we go there all the time. We have family reunions on the Bayou, and we've been there, and all of this took place there. So I'm just a bit emotional right now. I'll let Mr. Demery speak, because I'm just so upset over this woman and her children. I know this is over 150 years ago, but this is This is horrendous. This is terrible. I'll mute myself, Mr. Demery. You go ahead and speak. I'll talk late. I'll talk some more later on.
Yes, can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Greetings, Gus, and to 404. Good to hear from everybody tonight. I knew that tonight's commentary would be pretty sobering because of the content. One things that stood out to me was the constant descriptions of the characters. You know, if you're an enslaved individual, then it seems like the person who is enslaving you would not be described in any type of favorable, manner. And it just strikes me odd that, a person would have to be, despicable in order for the enslaved person to think that they were, a bad person. Because when they started out here with Mr. Freeman being a amenable, pious-hearted guy, described as favorable, when this guy, even when the woman's children was being sold from her, and she's crying out, begging and pleading, and then the guy says, well, okay, I'll take them both. What do you want for both of them? Then he turns around and says, no, the kid wasn't, he wouldn't sell them both together. Now you got them enslaved, and you can get money from a human being, and all she wanted was just to be with her child, and he was cold-hearted and wouldn't even do that. I don't see how he could be described as pious-hearted. And when he read the Bible, gathered them all around, that was just, you might as well call a brainwashing session, where he probably read certain types of scripture that, would lead the slave to believe that he had some type of reward coming for being obedient and acting a certain way and this and that, which just adds to the cunning and diabolical schemes of these people. Saying that he would kick, the adult women and men in the behinds and snap the whip on the ears of the young ones. It's just deplorable. But this guy, Mr. Ford, the master, he went from doing pretty well to owing quite a bit of debt. And I think that that was done quite regularly during those times when they owned slaves. They would enter into contracts with each other and end up owing some type of debt. And they would pay these debts by loaning out the slaves for labor. And, he got loaned out to this guy that he described as ignorant and despiteful. And he ended up for the first time, standing up for itself. You know, because it seemed odd that you would be born free. And like Gus, you had mentioned earlier, how quickly he was adapting to this enslaved environment. So if you were born free and not used to this type of treatment, then it had to be some rebellion, you know, coming forth. And so he got sick and tired of this guy and just started wailing on him. And, you know, the difference, the part where they got sick, they kept calling the man out of his name, calling him Clap, and constantly, you know, so I guess he had gotten used to that and just accepted that name. But when he self-diagnosed his condition, which, you know, showed his intelligence, but he had smallpox. And then I noticed that there was no medication given to him, no medical care of the people who was exposed to a deadly disease that had just killed someone. And the bell was tolling, and they were dying off left and right. And the doctor was just saying, well, if he make it a few days and make it till a certain time, he'll be all right. I guess you just in the hands of fate. There was some indication of mental illness in Elijah because it was just too much for her. You know, she thought about her kids being sold off from her constantly. She couldn't get it out of her mind. And sleep was the only rest that she was able to get. And when something is constantly on your mind, you can't forget about the hurt and the despair. It just started to drive her mad. And then this so-called preacher, William Ford, just the audacity of owning human chattel slaves and calling yourself a preacher. It's just defies all logic. And then he's being described as a kind, noble Christian man. It's just, you know, it's pretty hard to take, but, you know, I'll mute my line and give somebody else a chance and share a little later. Thanks for taking the call.
Appreciate the commentary. Other folks, if they have comments, the number again, 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943#. Press *6 if you would like to participate. The other person that called in from a blocked number and our caller on our Skype line, your line should be open as well.
Hello.
Yes, sir. We can hear you.
Apologies. I just tuned in. I caught like the last story. From what I can tell, it was I've only been able to see the trailer, but it was when he was asked to build something, and as a result of not doing it correctly, and I guess in the eyes of the overseer or whatever, he was attempted whipped, and he was hanged. So I didn't catch anything prior to that. But the question that I wanted to ask people who have seen the movie, has what's been heard kind of matched up with what you saw in the movie?
No, not based on what I saw. It is about 80% accurate so far, but no, it was off. Because especially with the selling of the children, they did not touch on that part in the movie. It just showed that they split the children up. And it did not show that there was somebody else who was willing to bargain and get the mother and the daughter together. That part was left out of the movie.
Thank you.
The beating scene is a little different as well. When he is putting the house together, or whatever, shed, barn, whatever, this structure, and Tibeats is going to whip him, and he beats him down. Number one, I thought it should have been longer, like, because he says in the book, like, he beat him longer than he could think, and like I was thinking this is going to be epic. Like, I was waiting on this scene in the film, but they shortened that, and then they shortened the black guy, Northrup, Mr. Northrup, beating Tibeats, and then they added all this where they go to lynch him, and he ends up dangling there for, like, I don't know, it seems like in the film, they have him dangling there for a long time. Like, that's not in the book at all. Like, they're just going to lynch him. Like, this is not a punishment. They're going to kill him. In the movie, they string him up to lynch him. Chapin comes out and, does his little speech, y'all get out of here, rah, rah, rah. They let him down, but they don't let him all the way down. So he's still kind of dangling just so that his feet are touching the ground, and they just kind of leave him there. And white people, other slaves are going around. They see this and he's just hanging there for a while. Like, that's not in the book at all. So they changed that pretty significantly as well.
That is true, Gus, because he was building the gazebo where the other guy, Tibeats or whatever his name is, he was just at it in for him ever since he showed him that they can transport the lumber by the waterway rather than dragging it through the forest. And he has been mad at him because here this uppity nigga that he knows engineering and navigational skills, and he has been mad since then. So he is the one, as you said, the scene where he was whooping up on the white man, they cut that down, because they couldn't have that in the movie to show this man getting his butt whooped from one end to the other. And instead they transferred it to him getting hung by these white people. They lengthened that portion of the scene. So they did a flip-flop.
How, like, have you and Gus compared your, and other people who have seen the film, compared your theater experience, like things you noticed people doing or saying while watching the film?
This will be our last film question. I don't want to get too off on the film, make sure we're on the book, but I didn't see it in the theater, so I can't give any response to how other people responded in the theater, or if they said anything or what have you, because I didn't watch it in the theater.
I went to the matinee because my husband said he was not going. He does not do slave movies. But from what I saw, it was pretty empty. There was a lot of older white people who were in there with me, and I sat in the section because I wanted to be by myself. I didn't want to be with them. It wasn't really that crowded in the theater. There were a lot of older blacks and older whites who were in there, but I was just mad. When I left out of there, I didn't cry because I didn't see anything in the movie to cry about. I was just furious when I left out of there, and they just know that they better just stay clear from me. I was just not in the mood. It was nothing foolish.
Good. One thing that I noticed in Garden Park's honesty is when he beat the white man down, he ran off. He didn't. The white man came and interrupted the beating and then sent Lawson off on a mule to fetch Master Ford. The guy just took off into the woods, and I think that he came upon, I think he made his way back to the plantation in the movie. But one thing that stood out is from the point where he was working and the plantation where Ford was, that was 27 miles. And if he was back there at the end of the day, he had to go back to work. You know, how was he transporting himself? Baby, that's you know, if he had to walk, you know, that's quite a ways. But you know, I didn't see the movie yet. I plan to go, and I think that if you go to see the movie, you know, you look at it, you know, so that you can learn, look for details, you know, and contrast and patterns, you know, where you can learn. Because a lot of these methods that were used, like when the one guy was fiddling or playing the violin, and then the master came up and said, "Oh, he's better than you are." That's that same tactic of pitting us against each other. And it goes on today, even in the workplace. If you're doing a good job, here comes the other guy. After, oh, well, he's doing a better job than you. You end up pitting one another against each other. That's a tactic that's used all the time.
The caller. Oh yeah, that's what I was going to. Go ahead.
And the things that stood out. It's Karma, and the things that good evening. The things that stood out the most for me was the fact that the intermediary in the sale was named Freeman, which is you know, it's a Jewish name. It's a derivative. It's just one of the names they put together. And so that was interesting to me that they had a Jewish character with a hand in the slave trade. But the next thing that really interested me was it's always a matter of the children. You know, it's like protecting the children. It seems every ounce of energy we have goes into protecting our children, mentally, emotionally, intellectually. And the fact that the thing that would bring the highest price is the ability to abuse this little black girl in a perverted way. $5,000 for the opportunity to abuse a black child in a perverted way. I marvel that this theme runs throughout this culture. Over and over, every century, the opportunity to abuse children. And it's not just our children. I mean, if you just go to the internet and you put in the word porn, not black porn or white porn or Indian porn, just porn, all you see is white men abusing what looks like their own little children. It's just integral to the culture. I mean, I could tell you stories of my little sister dying. It's just some white guy abusing a chance to abuse a black child, and the parents can't do anything about it. But that was the second thing that stood out. And the last thing that stood out was the fact that he went from great wealth to near, destitution. When I can't wrap my mind around the fact that you can have a human being working for you 16 hours a day from birth to death along with his parents and children, and yourself is still too stupid to make a profit? How stupid is that? I know people keep telling me that white people are so smart, they're so smart, but I see nothing but my evidence after evidence that these are the dumbest people on earth. How dumb do you have to be to not be able to make a profit with that kind of setup? And if you read these histories, especially the Texas histories, they would just go bust over and over again. How is that possible? So anyway, those were the three things that I observed.
How impossible indeed. I mean, in terms of possibility, like I said, I just came in, and apologies for that. But listening to the description of the confrontation between Solomon and I forgot the guy's name who he ended up fighting. It just didn't seem possible that he would survive that. I don't know a lot about slavery, but that just sounded like an incident that would demand his death sentence.
Well, Gus, go ahead. He was just poor white trash. This Tibeats guy, he was just like all these typical overseers, which is what we end up having on these law enforcement teams right now that patrolling the black area. Poor white trash, it comes out from wherever they live, and they want to patrol the black area because they want to abuse black and Hispanic people. And that's what this man was. He probably went from plantation to plantation to earn a keep, and he could not kill the slave because he was just a low-level overseer. It had another white man who was his boss before you get to the plantation owner. So the man told him, said, no, you can't kill him because this man have a mortgage on him. Flat is not your property. You can't just come in there and hang him and kill him or just do what you want to do to him.
Mm-hmm. Slaves are expensive. That's something I would keep in mind. So you just heard $5,000 for this child, $1,000 here. For white people, economically, you don't just want to be killing something that you have invested $1,000 in. There could be beatings and punishments, but I would not just be killing a person that I have invested all this in, particularly if the person is young enough that I'm expecting years more on my investment. And I would also say Frederick Douglass has a pretty similar story in his narrative where he talks about an overseer who's brought in to break him, and he pretty much does the same thing, beats him down, snatches him, and goes to work on him. So from those two incidents, I suspect this probably happened a little bit more than we've been led to believe, particularly if it's an overseer, not the direct owner, the white people who are operating the plantation, but just these lower level white people who've just been hired to look over it and what have you. I suspect that probably happened. But matter of fact, I think it's either an incident in the life of a slave girl, but it's in another biography that I read where a black female, she had been enslaved. She got into it with her white slave master. She was trying to beat her. It was a white female. She was trying to beat her, and she rebelled, snatched the whip from her, went after her. So I get the impression this probably happened quite a bit more often than we've been led to believe. It just gets omitted. Same thing like in the film where they shortened that scene, where white people just omit that, leave that out, don't talk about that.
I can see that.
Yep, I think you're right.
As you said, it's not calling people by their right name. As you saw in New Orleans, where they call these slaves by whatever name they feel like calling them, which I was listening to your show from last weekend, where the guy was saying he just call him Tyrone. His name is Terry, but we can just gonna call you Tyrone. We don't care what your name is. We just gonna make a name up for you, and you gonna answer to this name. And that's the same way how they did these people. You're whatever name it is we choose to call you. You're just gonna answer to it.
Did you all catch the part where Lethe, because I think we talked about this last week, where it was read, and again, keeping in mind this was told to an individual we suspect is a white male, so that probably had a big influence on how this was transcribed and the way that the story sounds. But Lethe, she was a black female who had been enslaved. Last week was talking about when they were on the ship going down to Louisiana, that she had spite in her eyes and just angry. And today when she's sold, it says, I think that's the last we hear of her. She's sold and she gets an angry look in her eyes again before she is sold off. I thought that was another one that could have been influence of white people, maybe not. But I don't know if you're supposed to look cheerful when you're being sold off to a racist. I don't know how you're supposed to look exactly. Was anyone surprised that even I think, Demery, before you touched on it, they didn't get any medical treatment when they... I think Mr. Northrup and some of the others who were suffering from smallpox, that they actually were taken to a hospital. Did that surprise anybody?
No, that didn't. Well, that they went to the hospital, I guess. I think that was just to put them in quarantine, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. That wasn't to treat them. I mean, I've read slave papers from Texas, and I remember one sentence clearly. He said, yes, I only spent $2.50 on this Negro, well, he didn't say Negro, all year long, and he brought in $250 worth of cotton. That's 1,000% increase. He said, over his medical care, the cornmeal that I gave him, and the fat back, I only had to put out $2.50, and I got back $250. Now, they do not spend any money on medical care for slaves. And another thing that I noticed was that smallpox, you should really go online and look at smallpox. It's still the most dangerously weaponized disease on this planet right now. And, you know, I'm lucky. At least I've had one vaccine. I'm old enough. But all the rest of you young people, you're just toast. You haven't had anything. But, yeah, no, they would never spend any money on medical care for slaves.
Well, I can remember reading someplace that one of the founding fathers inoculated his slaves against smallpox, and they was mentioning it in a way of how benevolent he was, but in reality, he was actually just using the serum on the slaves first to see how they would react, whether it would work or not, before he would do it to his own family.
Yep.
So
yeah, that was Jefferson. Yeah, that was Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, he was just beta testing.
And then you would have a situation where if you had smallpox, then the white people could be infected as well as the slaves. So that's another reason why you would want to give some type of care to these enslaved Africans. I could be incorrect, but that's just my view.
We cattle. They don't care. They could go get another one.
Yeah, I think it was just quarantine. I don't really think it was something humane. I think when you think that they're doing something humane, you should sit still and wait until that thought and that feeling passes. Because it will. It won't take long.
The section where I heard Mr. Fuller echo so loud when he says, I guess he's having his moment. I don't even know if you'd call it triumph, but he's pleased where he's built this raft to make their transport system more efficient for Mr. Ford. And I'll just read a little bit. I think this even goes, Carmen, where you were talking about they're not smart, they're not intelligent. You're talking about white people, where Mr. Northrup, he writes, on all sides, I heard Ford's Platt pronounced the smartest nigger in the Pine Woods. In fact, I was the Fulton of Indian Creek. I was not insensible to the praise bestowed upon me and enjoyed especially my triumph over Tatum, whose half-malicious ridicule had stung my pride. From this time, the entire control of bringing the lumber to Lamoury was placed in my hands until the contract was fulfilled. I heard Mr. Fuller in there repeatedly about the difference between a proud slave and a silly slave, about being black and proud. And I've heard Mr. Fuller where he has talked about what you're saying exactly, where white people can be very ignorant about many things and be dominating subjects, black people, non-white people, who have much greater expertise than they do in a variety of fields. All that means is, whoopee, these niggas will be balling for us. They can do all kinds of things for us. They can hook our crop system up and get us a crop rotation system so we can grow all kinds of things, and get us a great little raft system so we can transport our lumber or other products more efficiently, all that means is I have come up. Thank goodness. This is great. As long as we're dominating, if the slaves or if the non-white people, the victims, if they have a greater amount of intelligence than the white people do, as long as they're still dominating, this is still just going to go to benefit them. Whether they go bust with it, whether they use it to just refine and become more efficient about their means of domination, or whether they choose it to just sit around and lose all their money and end up having to sell everything. They're still in the most dominant position.
That's true.
Yes, but I think we're using the wrong model for them. I think that there's a difference between the most dominant. I think there's a difference between being smart and being dangerous. You know, like bubonic plague, people used to like actually worship it, didn't know where it came from. Was it God? Was it Satan? What could it be? Should we pray to it? Should we write letters? Should we grow plants of a certain kind? They just didn't know what it was, but it was lethal and it was dangerous. That doesn't mean it was highly evolved and smart. It was just a bacterium. And I think we need to really, look at a different kind of model instead of comparing them to us and saying that they are actually smart. Let's just say that they are actually very lethal.
I think that's a good point, but I think I'm sorry, am I interrupting?
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that's a very good point that she made up, but it's kind of like at the end of the day, whether they're smart or dangerous, their position, our position, is what it is. And if they're dumb, but still dangerous, we're still being dominated. If they're smart, they're still dangerous, we're still being dominated.
We have about 3 minutes before we get to the second audio portion. Want to make sure we have ample time to chat about things that are coming up. Any final points folks wanted to make sure they got in before we get to the next section? The word rascality, I had a great chuckle on that one. I'm going to see if I can weave that into my regular vocabulary somehow to brand someone, label them, or comment on their rascality. And then the sentence where he said, there were many of these, I could have picked a bunch, where he says, during my residence with Master Ford, I had seen only the bright side of slavery.
What I picked up on with religion, Sam, that they say they give Sam this Bible, and he got all religious and all involved in religion, and was reading a book. He couldn't read, but he got class to read the Bible to him, and he got some comfort from it. And it shows once again with us that when we get so hopeless and we think that there's nothing else to do, we got to look to the hereafter, and we get ourselves all immersed in a religion, even though we can see the contradiction. Here it is that this man is reading scriptures to you, this owner, and yet he's still mistreating you, and he has nothing to do but turn himself over to the religion of the enslaver, and he was just all happy to be toting around this Bible, even though you can read it. And this is where we came from, as they say, the slave sermon, where you just learn to recite certain passages in order to keep the slaves pacified. We can see where this is coming up from in this part with 12 Years a Slave, with this man Sam, where Northrup had to read the Bible to him, even though he was the one walking around with it.
Last thought. Everybody good? Last thought. Right on. If you did not comment during the first section, you had something you wanted to get in, just jot it down. We should have time to get all the commentary in during the second portion once the second audio clip concludes. If you didn't get a chance to dial in, I'll give out the number so you can ring in, get your thoughts, comments in once we get back on the line. The folks that dialed in, just mute your line. That way we will make sure we have clarity for the audio clip. If you can't mute yourself, I can do it, and I'll unmute everybody once we get ready for the second portion of the audio. Solomon Northrup, 12 Years a Slave, Context of White Supremacy, audio portion number 2.
Chapter 9. As the sun approached the meridian that day, it became insufferably warm. Its hot rays scorched the ground. The earth almost blistered the foot that stood upon it. I was without coat or hat, standing bareheaded, exposed to its burning blaze. Great drops of perspiration rolled down my face, drenching the scanty apparel wherewith I was clothed. Over the fence, a very little way off, the peach trees cast their cool, delicious shadows on the grass. I would gladly have given a long year of service to have been enabled to exchange the heated oven, as it were, wherein I stood, for a seat beneath their branches. But I was yet bound, the rope still dangling from my neck, and standing in the same tracks where Tibeats and his comrades left me. I could not move an inch, so firmly had I been bound. To have been enabled to lean against the weaving house would have been a luxury indeed, but it was far beyond my reach, though distant less than 20 feet. I wanted to lie down, but knew I could not rise again. The ground was so parched and boiling hot, I was aware it would but add to the discomfort of my situation. If I could have only moved my position, however slightly, it would have been relief unspeakable. But the hot rays of a southern sun, beating all the long summer day on my bare head, produced not half the suffering I experienced from my aching limbs. My wrists and ankles, and the cords of my legs and arms began to swell, burying the rope that bound them into the swollen flesh. All day Chapin walked back and forth upon the stoop, but not once approached me. He appeared to be in a state of great uneasiness, looking first towards me, and then up the road, as if expecting some arrival every moment. He did not go to the field, as was his custom. It was evident from his manner that he supposed Tibeats would return with more and better armed assistance, perhaps to renew the quarrel, and it was equally evident he had prepared his mind to defend my life at whatever hazard. Why he did not relieve me, why he suffered me to remain in agony the whole weary day, I never knew. It was not for want of sympathy, I am certain. Perhaps he wished Ford to see the rope about my neck, and the brutal manner in which I had been bound. Perhaps his interference with another's property in which he had no legal interest might have been a trespass, which would have subjected him to the penalty of the law. Why Tibeats was all day absent was another mystery I never could divine. He knew well enough that Chapin would not harm him unless he persisted in his design against me. Lawson told me afterwards that, as he passed the plantation of John David Cheney, he saw the three, and that they turned and looked after him as he flew by. I think his supposition was that Lawson had been sent out by Overseer Chapin to arouse the neighboring planters, and to call on them to come to his assistance. He therefore undoubtedly acted on the principle that discretion is the better part of valor, and kept away. But whatever motive may have governed the cowardly and malignant tyrant, it is of no importance. There I still stood in the noontide sun, groaning with pain. From long before daylight I had not eaten a morsel. I was growing faint from pain and thirst and hunger. Once only, in the very hottest portion of the day, Rachel, half fearful she was acting contrary to the overseer's wishes, ventured to me and held a cup of water to my lips. The humble creature never knew, nor could she comprehend, if she had heard them, the blessings I invoked upon her for that balmy draught. She could only say, "Oh, Platt, how I do pity you," and then hastened back to her labors in the kitchen. Never did the sun move so slowly through the heavens. Never did it shower down such fervent and fiery rays as it did that day. At least, so it appeared to me. What my meditations were, the innumerable thoughts that thronged through my distracted brain, I will not attempt to give expression to. Suffice it to say, during the whole long day I came not to the conclusion, even once, that the Southern slave, fed, clothed, whipped, and protected by his master, is happier than the free-colored citizen of the North. To that conclusion I have never since arrived. There are many, however, even in the Northern States, benevolent and well-disposed men who will pronounce my opinion erroneous and gravely proceed to substantiate the assertion with an argument. Alas, they have never drank, as I have, from the bitter cup of slavery. Just at sunset my heart leaped with unbounded joy as Ford came riding into the yard, his horse covered with foam. Chapin met him at the door, and after conversing a short time, he walked directly to me. "Poor Platt, you are in a bad state," was the only expression that escaped his lips. "Thank God," said I, "thank God, Master Ford, that you have come at last." Drawing a knife from his pocket, he indignantly cut the cord from my wrists, arms, and ankles, and slipped the noose from my neck. I attempted to walk, but staggered like a drunken man, and fell partially to the ground. Ford returned immediately to the house, leaving me alone again. As he reached the piazza, Tibeats and his two friends rode up. A dialogue followed. I could hear the sound of their voices, the mild tones of Ford mingling with the angry accents of Tibeats, but was unable to distinguish what was said. Finally, the three departed again, apparently not well pleased. I endeavored to raise the hammer, thinking to show Ford how willing I was to work, by proceeding with my labors on the weaving house, but it fell from my nerveless hand. At dark I crawled into the cabin and laid down. I was in great misery, all sore and swollen, the slightest movement producing excruciating suffering. Soon the hands came in from the field. Rachel, when she went after Lawson, had told them what had happened. Eliza and Mary broiled me a piece of bacon, but my appetite was gone. Then they scorched some cornmeal and made coffee. It was all that I could take. Eliza consoled me and was very kind. It was not long before the cabin was full of slaves. They gathered round me, asking many questions about the difficulty with Tibeats in the morning, and the particulars of all the occurrences of the day. Then Rachel came in, and in her simple language repeated it over again, dwelling emphatically on the kick that sent Tibeats rolling over on the ground, whereupon there was a general titter throughout the crowd. Then she described how Chapin walked out with his pistols and rescued me, and how Master Ford cut the ropes with his knife just as if he was mad. By this time Lawson had returned. He had to regale them with an account of his trip to the pine woods, how the brown mule bore him faster than a streak o' lightning, how he astonished everybody as he flew along, how Master Ford started right away, how he said Platt was a good nigger and they shouldn't kill him, concluding with pretty strong intimations that there was not another human being in the wide world who could have created such a universal sensation on the road or performed such a marvelous John Gilpin feat as he had done that day on the brown mule. The kind creatures loaded me with the expression of their sympathy, saying Tibeats was a hard, cruel man, and hoping Massa Ford would get me back again. In this manner they passed the time, discussing, chatting, talking over and over again the exciting affair, until suddenly Chapin presented himself at the cabin door and called me. "Platt," said he, "you will sleep on the floor in the great house tonight. Bring your blanket with you." I arose as quickly as I was able, took my blanket in my hand, and followed him. On the way he informed me that he should not wonder if Tibeats was back again before morning, that he intended to kill me, and that he did not mean he should do it without witnesses. Had he stabbed me to the heart in the presence of 100 slaves, not one of them, by the laws of Louisiana, could have given evidence against him. I laid down on the floor in the great house, the first and the last time such a sumptuous resting place was granted me during my 12 years of bondage, and tried to sleep. Near midnight the dog began to bark. Chapin arose, looked from the window, but could discover nothing. At length the dog was quiet. As he returned to his room, he said, "I believe, Platt, that scoundrel is skulking about the premises somewhere. If the dog barks again and I am sleeping, wake me." I promised to do so. After the lapse of an hour or more, the dog recommenced his clamor, running towards the gate, then back again, all the while barking furiously. Chapin was out of bed without waiting to be called. On this occasion he stepped forth upon the piazza and remained standing there a considerable length of time. Nothing, however, was to be seen, and the dog returned to his kennel. We were not disturbed again during the night. The excessive pain that I suffered and the dread of some impending danger prevented any rest whatever. Whether or not Tibeats did actually return to the plantation that night, seeking an opportunity to wreak his vengeance upon me, is a secret known only to himself, perhaps. I thought then, however, and have the strong impression still, that he was there. At all events, he had the disposition of an assassin, cowering before a brave man's words, but ready to strike his helpless or unsuspecting victim in the back, as I had reason afterwards to know. At daylight in the morning I arose, sore and weary, having rested little. Nevertheless, after partaking breakfast, which Mary and Eliza had prepared for me in the cabin, I proceeded to the weaving-house and commenced the labors of another day. It was Chapin's practice, as it is the practice of overseers generally, immediately on arising, to bestride his horse, always saddled and bridled and ready for him, the particular business of some slave, and ride into the field. This morning, on the contrary, he came to the weaving-house, asking if I had seen anything of Tibeats yet. Replying in the negative, he remarked there was something not right about the fellow, there was bad blood in him, that I must keep a sharp watch of him, or he would do me wrong some day when I least expected it. While he was yet speaking, Tibeats rode in, hitched his horse, and entered the house. I had little fear of him while Ford and Chapin were at hand, but they could not be near me always. Oh, how heavily the weight of slavery pressed upon me then! I must toil day after day, endure abuse and taunts and scoffs, sleep on the hard ground, live on the coarsest fare, and not only this, but live the slave of a blood-seeking wretch, of whom I must stand henceforth in continued fear and dread. Why had I not died in my young years, before God had given me children to love and live for? What unhappiness and suffering and sorrow it would have prevented! I sighed for liberty. But the bondsman's chain was round me, and could not be shaken off. I could only gaze wistfully towards the north, and think of the thousands of miles that stretched between me and the soil of freedom, over which a black freeman may not pass. Tibeats, in the course of half an hour, walked over to the weaving-house, looked at me sharply, then returned without saying anything. Most of the forenoon he sat on the piazza, reading a newspaper and conversing with Ford. After dinner the latter left for the pine woods, and it was indeed with regret that I beheld him depart from the plantation. Once more during the day Tibeats came to me, gave me some order, and returned. During the week the weaving-house was completed, Tibeats in the meantime making no allusion whatever to the difficulty, when I was informed he had hired me to Peter Tanner, to work under another carpenter by the name of Myers. This announcement was received with gratification, as any place was desirable that would relieve me of his hateful presence. Peter Tanner, as the reader has already been informed, lived on the opposite shore, and was the brother of Mistress Ford. He is one of the most extensive planters on Bayou Buff, and owns a large number of slaves. Over I went to Tanner's, joyfully enough. He had heard of my late difficulties. In fact, I ascertained the flogging of Tibeats was soon blazoned far and wide. This affair, together with my rafting experiment, had rendered me somewhat notorious. More than once I heard it said that Platt Ford, now Platt Tibeats, a slave's name changes with his change of master, was a devil of a nigger. But I was destined to make a still further noise, as will presently be seen, throughout the little world of Bayou Buff. Peter Tanner endeavored to impress upon me the idea that he was quite severe, though I could perceive there was a vein of good humor in the old fellow, after all. "You're the nigger," he said to me on my arrival. "You're the nigger that flogged your master, eh? You're the nigger that kicks and holds Carpenter Tibeats by the leg and wallops him, are you? I'd like to see you hold me by the leg, I should. You're a portent character. You're a great nigger, very remarkable nigger, ain't you? I'd lash you. I'd take the tantrums out of you. Just take hold of my leg, if you please. None of your pranks here, my boy, remember that. Now go to work, you kickin' rascal," concluded Peter Tanner, unable to suppress a half-comical grin at his own wit and sarcasm. After listening to this salutation, I was taken charge of by Myers, and labored under his direction for a month to his and my own satisfaction. Like William Ford, his brother-in-law, Tanner was in the habit of reading the Bible to his slaves on the Sabbath, but in a somewhat different spirit. He was an impressive commentator on the New Testament. The first Sunday after my coming to the plantation, he called them together and began to read the 12th chapter of Luke. When he came to the 47th verse, he looked deliberately around him, and continued, "And that servant which knew his Lord's will," Here he paused, looking around more deliberately than before, and again proceeded, which knew his Lord's will, and prepared not himself. Here was another pause. Prepared not himself, neither did according to his will, shall be beaten with many stripes. "Do you hear that?" demanded Peter emphatically. "Stripes," he repeated slowly and distinctly, taking off his spectacles preparatory to making a few remarks. "That nigger that don't take care, that don't obey his Lord, that's his master, d'ye see? That 'ere nigger shall be beaten with many stripes. Now many signifies a great many, 40, 100, 150 lashes. That's Scripter." And so Peter continued to elucidate the subject for a great length of time, much to the edification of his sable audience. At the conclusion of the exercises, calling up 3 of his slaves, Warner, Will, and Major, he cried out to me, "Here, Platt, you held Tibeats by the legs. Now I'll see if you can hold these rascals in the same way till I get back from meeting." Thereupon he ordered them to the stocks, a common thing on plantations in the Red River country. The stocks are formed of 2 planks, the lower one made fast at the ends to 2 short posts, driven firmly into the ground. At regular distances half-circles are cut in the upper edge. The other plank is fastened to one of the posts by a hinge, so that it can be opened or shut down, in the same manner as the blade of a pocket-knife is shut or opened. In the lower edge of the upper plank corresponding half-circles are also cut, so that when they close a row of holes is formed large enough to admit a Negro's leg above the ankle, but not large enough to enable him to draw out his foot. The other end of the upper plank, opposite the hinge, is fastened to its post by lock and key. The slave is made to sit upon the ground. When the uppermost plank is elevated, his legs, just above the ankles, placed in the sub-half circles, and shutting it down again, and locking it, he is held secure and fast. Very often the neck instead of the ankle is enclosed. In this manner they are held during the operation of whipping. Warner, Will, and Major, according to Tanner's account of them, were melon-stealing, Sabbath-breaking niggers, and not approving of such wickedness, he felt it his duty to put them in the stocks. Handing me the key, himself, Myers, Mistress Tanner, and the children entered the carriage and drove away to church at Cheneyville. When they were gone, the boys begged me to let them out. I felt sorry to see them sitting on the hot ground, and remembered my own sufferings in the sun. Upon their promise to return to the stocks at any moment they were required to do so, I consented to release them. Grateful for the lenity shown them, and in order in some measure to repay it, they could do no less, of course, than pilot me to the melon patch. Shortly before Tanner's return, they were in the stocks again. Finally he drove up, and looking at the boys, said with a chuckle, "Aha, ye haven't been strolling about much today, anyway. I'll teach you what's what. I'll tire ye of eating watermelons on the Lord's Day, ye Sabbath-breaking niggers." Peter Tanner prided himself upon his strict religious observances. He was a deacon in the church. But I have now reached a point in the progress of my narrative when it becomes necessary to turn away from these light descriptions to the more grave and weighty matter of the second battle with Master Tibeats, and the flight through the great Pacodry swamp. Chapter 10. At the end of a month, my services being no longer required at Tanner's, I was sent over the bayou again to my master, whom I found engaged in building the cotton press. This was situated at some distance from the great house, in a rather retired place. I commenced working once more in company with Tibeats, being entirely alone with him most part of the time. I remembered the words of Chapin, his precautions, his advice to beware, lest in some unsuspecting moment he might injure me. They were always in my mind, so that I lived in a most uneasy state of apprehension and fear. One eye was on my work, the other on my master. I determined to give him no cause of offense, to work still more diligently, if possible, than I had done, to bear whatever abuse he might heap upon me, save bodily injury, humbly and patiently, hoping thereby to soften in some degree his manner towards me, until the blessed time might come when I should be delivered from his clutches. The 3rd morning after my return, Chapin left the plantation for Cheneyville, to be absent until night. Tibeats, on that morning, was attacked with one of those periodical fits of spleen and ill humor to which he was frequently subject, rendering him still more disagreeable and venomous than usual. It was about 9 o'clock in the forenoon, when I was busily employed with the jack-plane on one of the sweeps. Tibeats was standing by the workbench, fitting a handle into the chisel, with which he had been engaged previously in cutting the thread of the screw. "You are not planing that down enough," said he. "It is just even with the line," I replied. "You're a damned liar," he exclaimed passionately. "Oh, well, master," I said mildly, "I will plane it down more if you say so," at the same time proceeding to do as I supposed he desired. Before one shaving had been removed, however, he cried out, saying I had now planed it too deep. It was too small. I had spoiled the sweep entirely. Then followed curses and imprecations. I had endeavored to do exactly as he directed, but nothing would satisfy the unreasonable man. In silence and in dread I stood by the sweep, holding the jack-plane in my hand, not knowing what to do, and not daring to be idle. His anger grew more and more violent, until finally, with an oath, such a bitter, frightful oath as only Tibeats could utter, he seized a hatchet from the workbench and darted towards me, swearing he would cut my head open. It was a moment of life or death. The sharp, bright blade of the hatchet glittered in the sun. In another instant it would be buried in my brain, and yet in that instant, so quick will a man's thoughts come to him in such a fearful strait, I reasoned with myself. If I stood still, my doom was certain. If I fled, 10 chances to 1 the hatchet, flying from his hand with a too deadly and unerring aim, would strike me in the back. There was but one course to take. Springing towards him with all my power, and meeting him full halfway before he could bring down the blow, with one hand I caught his uplifted arm, with the other seized him by the throat. We stood looking each other in the eyes. In his I could see murder. I felt as if I had a serpent by the neck, watching the slightest relaxation of my grip to coil itself round my body, crushing and stinging it to death. I thought to scream aloud, trusting that some ear might catch the sound, but Chapin was away. The hands were in the field. There was no living soul in sight or hearing. The good genius, which thus far through life has saved me from the hands of violence, at that moment suggested a lucky thought. With a vigorous and sudden kick that brought him on one knee, with a groan, I released my hold upon his throat, snatched the hatchet, and cast it beyond reach. Frantic with rage, maddened beyond control, he seized a white oak stick, 5 feet long perhaps, and as large in circumference as his hand could grasp, which was lying on the ground. Again he rushed towards me, and again I met him, seized him about the waist, and being the stronger of the two, bore him to the earth. While in that position I obtained possession of the stick, and rising, cast it from me also. He likewise arose and ran for the broad-axe on the workbench. Fortunately, there was a heavy plank lying upon its broad blade, in such a manner that he could not extricate it, before I had sprung upon his back, pressing him down closely and heavily on the plank so that the axe was held more firmly in its place. I endeavored, but in vain, to break his grasp upon the handle. In that position we remained some minutes. There have been hours in my unhappy life, many of them when the contemplation of death as the end of earthly sorrow, of the grave as a resting place for the tired and worn-out body, has been pleasant to dwell upon. But such contemplations vanish in the hour of peril. No man in his full strength can stand undismayed in the presence of the King of Terrors. Life is dear to every living thing. The worm that crawls upon the ground will struggle for it. At that moment it was dear to me, enslaved and treated as I was. Not able to unloose his hand, once more I seized him by the throat, and this time with a vice-like grip that soon relaxed his hold. He became pliant and unstrung. His face, that had been white with passion, was now black from suffocation. Those small serpent eyes that spat such venom were now full of horror, 2 great white orbs starting from their sockets. There was a lurking devil in my heart that prompted me to kill the human bloodhound on the spot, to retain the grip on his accursed throat till the breath of life was gone. I dared not murder him, and I dared not let him live. If I killed him, my life must pay the forfeit. If he lived, my life only would satisfy his vengeance. A voice within whispered me to fly, to be a wanderer among the swamps, a fugitive and a vagabond on the face of the earth was preferable to the life that I was leading. My resolution was soon formed, and swinging him from the workbench to the ground, I leaped a fence nearby and hurried across the plantation, passing the slaves at work in the cotton field. At the end of a quarter of a mile I reached the wood pasture, and it was a short time indeed that I had been running it. Climbing on to a high fence, I could see the cotton press, the great house, and the space between. It was a conspicuous position, from whence the whole plantation was in view. I saw Tibeats cross the field towards the house and enter it. Then he came out, carrying his saddle, and presently mounted his horse and galloped away. I was desolate, but thankful. Thankful that my life was spared, desolate and discouraged with the prospect before me. What would become of me? Who would befriend me? Whither should I fly? O God, thou who gavest me life, and implanted in my bosom the love of life, who filled it with emotions such as other men, thy creatures have, do not forsake me. Have pity on the poor slave. Let me not perish. If thou dost not protect me, I am lost, lost. Such supplications, silently and unuttered, ascended from my inmost heart to heaven. But there was no answering voice, no sweet low tone coming down from on high, whispering to my soul, "It is I, be not afraid." I was the forsaken of God, it seemed, the despised and hated of men. In about 3/4 of an hour, several of the slaves shouted and made signs for me to run. Presently, looking up the bayou, I saw Tibeats and 2 others on horseback, coming at a fast gait, followed by a troop of dogs. There were as many as 8 or 10. Distant as I was, I knew them. They belonged on the adjoining plantation. The dogs used on Bayou Buff for hunting slaves are a kind of bloodhound, but a far more savage breed than is found in the northern states. They will attack a Negro at their master's bidding and cling to him as the common bulldog will cling to a 4-footed animal. Frequently their loud bay is heard in the swamps, and then there is speculation as to what point the runaway will be overhauled, the same as a New York hunter stops to listen to the hounds coursing along the hillsides, and suggests to his companion that the fox will be taken at such a place. I never knew a slave escaping with his life from Bayou Buff. One reason is they are not allowed to learn the art of swimming, and are incapable of crossing the most inconsiderable stream. In their flight they can go in no direction but a little way without coming to a bayou, when the inevitable alternative is presented of being drowned or overtaken by the dogs. In youth I had practiced in the clear streams that flow through my native district, until I had become an expert swimmer, and felt at home in the watery element. I stood upon the fence until the dogs had reached the cotton press. In an instant more, their long, savage yells announced they were on my track. Leaping down from my position, I ran towards the swamp. Fear gave me strength, and I exerted it to the utmost. Every few moments I could hear the yelpings of the dogs. They were gaining upon me. Every howl was nearer and nearer. Each moment I expected they would spring upon my back, expected to feel their long teeth sinking into my flesh. There were so many of them. I knew they would tear me to pieces, that they would worry me, at once, to death. I gasped for breath, gasped forth a half-uttered, choking prayer to the Almighty to save me, to give me strength to reach some wide, deep bayou where I could throw them off the track or sink into its waters. Presently I reached a thick palmetto bottom. As I fled through them they made a loud rustling noise, not loud enough, however, to drown the voices of the dogs. Continuing my course due south, as nearly as I can judge, I came at length to water just over Shoe. The hounds at that moment could not have been 5 rods behind me. I could hear them crashing and plunging through the palmettos, their loud, eager yells making the whole swamp clamorous with the sound. Hope revived a little as I reached the water. If it were only deeper, they might lose the scent, and thus disconcerted, afford me the opportunity of evading them. Luckily, it grew deeper the farther I proceeded, now over my ankles, now halfway to my knees, now sinking a moment to my waist, and then emerging presently into more shallow places. The dogs had not gained upon me since I struck the water. Evidently, they were confused. Now their savage intonations grew more and more distant, assuring me that I was leaving them. Finally, I stopped to listen, but the long howl came booming on the air again, telling me I was not yet safe. From bog to bog where I had stepped, they could still keep upon the track, though impeded by the water. At length, to my great joy, I came to a wide bayou, and plunging in, had soon stemmed its sluggish current to the other side. There, certainly, the dogs would be confounded, the current carrying down the stream all traces of that slight, mysterious scent which enables the quick-smelling hound to follow in the track of the fugitive. After crossing this bayou, the water became so deep I could not run. I was now in what I afterwards learned was the Great Pacodry Swamp. It was filled with immense trees, the sycamore, the gum, the cottonwood, and cypress, and extends, I am informed, to the shore of the Calcasieu River. For 30 or 40 miles it is without inhabitants, save wild beasts, the bear, the wildcat, the tiger, and great slimy reptiles that are crawling through it everywhere. Long before I reached the bayou, in fact, from the time I struck the water until I emerged from the swamp on my return, these reptiles surrounded me. I saw hundreds of moccasin snakes. Every log and bog, every trunk of a fallen tree over which I was compelled to step or climb was alive with them. They crawled away at my approach, but sometimes in my haste I almost placed my hand or foot upon them. They are poisonous serpents, their bite more fatal than the rattlesnakes. Besides, I had lost one shoe, the sole having come entirely off, leaving the upper only dangling to my ankle. I saw also many alligators, great and small, lying in the water or on pieces of floodwood. The noise I made usually startled them, when they moved off and plunged into the deepest places. Sometimes, however, I would come directly upon a monster before observing it. In such cases, I would start back, run a short way round, and in that manner shun them. Straightforward, they will run a short distance rapidly, but do not possess the power of turning. In a crooked race, there is no difficulty in evading them. About 2 o'clock in the afternoon I heard the last of the hounds. Probably they did not cross the bayou. Wet and weary, but relieved from the sense of instant peril, I continued on, more cautious and afraid, however, of the snakes and alligators than I had been in the earlier portion of my flight. Now, before stepping into a muddy pool, I would strike the water with a stick. If the waters moved, I would go around it. If not, would venture through. At length the sun went down, and gradually night's trailing mantle shrouded the great swamp in darkness. Still, I staggered on, fearing every instant I should feel the dreadful sting of the moccasin, or be crushed within the jaws of some disturbed alligator. The dread of them now almost equaled the fear of the pursuing hounds. The moon arose after a time, its mild light creeping through the overspreading branches, loaded with long pendant moss. I kept traveling forwards until after midnight, hoping all the while that I would soon emerge into some less desolate and dangerous region, but the water grew deeper, and the walking more difficult than ever. I perceived it would be impossible to proceed much farther, and knew not, moreover, what hands I might fall into, should I succeed in reaching a human habitation. Not provided with a pass, any white man would be at liberty to arrest me and place me in prison until such time as my master should prove property, pay charges, and take me away. I was an estray, and if so unfortunate as to meet a law-abiding citizen of Louisiana, he would deem it his duty to his neighbor, perhaps, to put me forthwith in the pound. Really, it was difficult to determine which I had most reason to fear, dogs, alligators, or men. After midnight, however, I came to a halt. Imagination cannot picture the dreariness of the scene. The swamp was resonant with the quacking of innumerable ducks. Since the foundation of the earth, in all probability, a human footstep had never before so far penetrated the recesses of the swamp. It was not silent now, silent to a degree that rendered it oppressive, as it was when the sun was shining in the heavens. My midnight intrusion had awakened the feathered tribes, which seemed to throng the morass in hundreds of thousands, and their garrulous throats poured forth such multitudinous sounds. There was such a fluttering of wings, such sullen plunges in the water all around me, that I was affrighted and appalled. All the fowls of the air and all the creeping things of the earth appeared to have assembled together in that particular place for the purpose of filling it with clamor and confusion. Not by human dwellings, not in crowded cities alone, are the sights and sounds of life. The wildest places of the earth are full of them. Even in the heart of that dismal swamp, God had provided a refuge and a dwelling place for millions of living things. The moon had now risen above the trees when I resolved upon a new project. Thus far I had endeavored to travel as nearly south as possible. Turning about, I proceeded in a northwest direction, my object being to strike the pine woods in the vicinity of Master Ford's. Once within the shadow of his protection, I felt I would be comparatively safe. My clothes were in tatters, my hands, face, and body covered with scratches received from the sharp knots of fallen trees and in climbing over piles of brush and floodwood. My bare foot was full of thorns. I was besmeared with muck and mud and the green slime that had collected on the surface of the dead water, in which I had been immersed to the neck many times during the day and night. Hour after hour, and tiresome indeed had they become, I continued to plod along on my northwest course. The water began to grow less deep, and the ground more firm under my feet. At last I reached the Pacadry, the same wide bayou I had swam while outward bound. I swam it again, and shortly after thought I heard a cock crow, but the sound was faint, and it might have been a mockery of the ear. The water receded from my advancing footsteps. Now I had left the bogs behind me. Now I was on dry land that gradually ascended to the plain, and I knew I was somewhere in the great pine woods. Just at daybreak I came to an opening, a sort of small plantation, but one I had never seen before. In the edge of the woods I came upon two men, a slave and his young master, engaged in catching wild hogs. The white man I knew would demand my pass, and not able to give him one, would take me into possession. I was too weary to run again, and too desperate to be taken, and therefore adopted a ruse that proved entirely successful. Assuming a fierce expression, I walked directly towards him, looking him steadily in the face. As I approached, he moved backwards with an air of alarm. It was plain he was much affrighted, that he looked upon me as some infernal goblin just arisen from the bowels of the swamp. "Where does William Ford live?" I demanded, in no gentle tone. "He lives 7 miles from here," was the reply. "Which is the way to his place?" I again demanded, trying to look more fiercely than ever. "Do you see those pine trees yonder?" he asked, pointing to 2 a mile distant, that rose far above their fellows, like a couple of tall sentinels overlooking the broad expanse of forest. "I see them," was the answer. "At the feet of those pine trees," he continued, "runs the Texas road. Turn to the left, and it will lead you to William Ford's." Without further parley, I hastened forward, happy as he was, no doubt, to place the widest possible distance between us. Striking the Texas road, I turned to the left hand, as directed, and soon passed a great fire, where a pile of logs were burning. I went to it, thinking I would dry my clothes, but the gray light of the morning was fast breaking away. Some passing white man might observe me. Besides, the heat overpowered me with the desire of sleep, so lingering no longer, I continued my travels, and finally, about 8 o'clock, reached the house of Master Ford. The slaves were all absent from the quarters, at their work. Stepping onto the piazza, I knocked at the door, which was soon opened by Mistress Ford. My appearance was so changed, I was in such a woe-begone and forlorn condition, she did not know me. Inquiring if Master Ford was at home, that good man made his appearance. Before the question could be answered, I told him of my flight, and all the particulars connected with it. He listened attentively, and when I had concluded, spoke to me kindly and sympathetically, and taking me to the kitchen, called John, and ordered him to prepare me food. I had tasted nothing since daylight the previous morning. When John had set the meal before me, the madam came out with a bowl of milk and many little delicious dainties, such as rarely please the palate of a slave. I was hungry, and I was weary, but neither food nor rest afforded half the pleasure as did the blessed voices speaking kindness and consolation. It was the oil and the wine which the Good Samaritan in the great pine woods was ready to pour into the wounded spirit of the slave, who came to him, stripped of his raiment and half dead. They left me in the cabin that I might rest. Blessed be sleep! It visiteth all alike, descending as the dews of heaven on the bond and free. Soon it nestled to my bosom, driving away the troubles that oppressed it, and bearing me to that shadowy region where I saw again the faces and listened to the voices of my children, who, alas, for aught I knew in my waking hours, had fallen into the arms of that other sleep, from which they never would arouse.
Context of White Supremacy. The number to dial is 760-569-7676, and the code is 564943#. Press *6 if you would like to participate. Number again is 760-569-7676, and the code is 564943#. Press *6 if you would like to participate. We should have over 30 minutes remaining. Please do not wait until the last minute if you think you would like to share a thought, ask a question, contribute to the exchange of views. I think there was some more deviation in this portion as well. I did say that I think in the film, the first scene where Tibeats and Mr. Northrup, where they get into it, that they do not, in the book, they do not write that Mr. Northrup is hanging from a tree. He is still bound. He is still bound. He has the rope on him, but in the film, they have him as being literally hanging from a tree, like his toes barely scraping the ground. And I don't think it's anything that dramatic in the book. I think what we just heard, that he's still bound, he's not able to walk, he has difficulty moving, and he's left out in the sun. It seems that his major gripe is about being in the sun, that he can't move and get to a spot where he could be in the shade, that he could sit on the ground, but the ground is hot. He's just been left out in this hot spot where he really can't move because he's been bound. I think that's a slight difference from what they have in the film, but at any rate, the folks who are on the line with us currently, we should have our Skype caller, not sure, I think it's 404, I'm not sure, and Mr. Demery 4, your lines should all be open. I'll catch any other hands as I see them. Any thoughts? Everyone just hanging out. Any thoughts? That's how fascinating.
Hey, Gus?
Yes, sir.
Can you, I guess something that I've been thinking about is the part, I guess is after Master Ford came to reconcile the conflict or whatever. And I know you guys have said what you said, like about how slaves were investments, but that just always seems so strange and peculiar to me, like that he would go to such an extent to protect Platt or Mr. Northrup. That's just something that I've been thinking about. It just seems really peculiar to me.
I feel like there are other examples. I'm going to ponder on that. I feel like there are other examples because Frederick Douglass, when he beats up his white overseer, he doesn't get in trouble either. Like he doesn't get beaten or anything either. I feel like I'll ponder on. I definitely see what you're saying. I definitely see what you're saying with regards to this white person stepping in to protect this unruly nigger who's put his hands on a white person like this, from what we've been told, and just there being a system of white supremacy that's supposed to be totally unacceptable. punishable, serious infraction on the plantation. You definitely don't want to give the idea that, hey, you slaves can run around and, put your hands on a white man anytime you disagree with what's happening.
Even in the case of that you cited with Frederick Douglass, and how I think it was 404, she was saying, how the guy was just poor white trash. But when I think about it, the white part of white trash has some type of redemptive connotation to it. It's like, it's trash, but it's white trash. It can go through a process of, of redemption or where it gets, where it becomes on par with the white people who are at the higher echelons of society. But so when I'm thinking about it, even though it's white trash, it's still white trash. It just throws me for a loop.
Well, this is 404. What I was going to say, even though that, as you said, yes, he is part of the white team, but they still have their so-called classism set up between the white structure, where they keep their whites, they so-called white trash in the lower echelons, and those are the ones that are normally the most brutal, because they're trying to show that they want to move up. So the more brutality that they can do, which is why they go on these plantations and they take out their brutality on the slaves, and within which can make their money, so that they can go and own a piece of land and get some slaves themselves to move themselves up the food chain. But once again, that is why I'm saying that this got to be white people writing this story, because the way how they have this stuff so sympathetic that he is going through all of this to go to this Ford plantation because this man was so nice to him, even though he is still a slave owner.
Right.
To me, that's why, white people hands is in this, and they wrote this whole thing to put themselves in a good light, playing this good cop, bad cop situation with this man. Because Louisiana, Arkansas, and Mississippi, they have some of the most brutal plantations that you could ever want to be a slave on. They were very, very brutal. They said the average age span for slaves in Louisiana, because of the heat, and especially where he was working in the swamp, the bayous, and those places, your life expectancy is not that great for a slave. Your turnover rate is very high.
I think, too, just the tone in this book, I think that's definitely something to keep in mind as well about, the authenticity of this work and whether or not white people just concocted a story that they wanted to tell. But I think, too, and I think this might help explain how this happens either way, whether this is a fictitious account that racists put together or whether this is truthful, this really happened, that it seems that the white people, other than Tibeats, they don't view, at least from the writing, they don't seem to view Mr. Northrup as an insurrectionary slave. I think they say after that Platt is a good nigger. They view him as a hard worker. He's somebody who hooked our raft system up for us, who doesn't mind working extra hard as long as he has a quote-unquote gentle slave master. I think that probably had a big impact on this as well. I think if they had seen him as someone who was trying to run away or who was insolent, didn't do what he was told on a regular basis, I think that also would have had a big impact on how they viewed all of this. And particularly since I think it was the other white man's name, Chapin, who had given him the nails, and I guess he went to him first in building this structure. that he had another white person who could co-sign on this and say, hey, he is doing what he's told. He came to me. He got his directions. He's doing what I was told. Tibeats, if you don't like this, it's on you. He's doing what he was told. He shouldn't be getting beat for this. I think just the fact that he has a reputation for being a good nigger, a good slave, I think probably factored a long way in this as well, if this is accurate. But I think it's equally probable that, white people could have just made up a fictitious account to present, to give you some good white people, some good slave masters that slaves wouldn't even mind working extra hard for. I'll mute my line.
I can see both of you guys' points. Maybe it was just my racial retardation had me stumbling.
No, as you said, he's a valuable piece of property because they can see the intelligence in him that he's not the average nigger, as they call them. He has some intelligence on him, and they can see that he is somewhat learned, even though he tries to downplay and fall into the role of being a slave. But it still shows out that he is not really one of them. He was not born of this lot, according to how the book is running. But this whole idea of the good white man and the good slave master and all of that, this is starting to grate on me, because there's no such thing as no good slave owner or no good overseer. You're still gonna get your lashes. They might cut it down from a dozen or maybe give you 6, but you're still getting beat.
Have you heard?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
I think that there's more propaganda than we think in this book. I don't. We talk about this and we say that the most important thing seems to be the domination and keeping the white supremacy in place, keeping the hierarchy in place, even if that costs money. And I think we've come to some really logical conclusions. Even if that costs money, they're willing to do that. So the fact that he would totally disrupt the hierarchy by drawing, his weapon on another white man and saying that, it's because of the money, I don't think any of that makes sense. I think there's a lot of propaganda in this, and I don't even think he likes William Ford that much, because William Ford literally sold him to someone he knew was sadistic and psychopathic and put him directly in harm's way. So I think there's just so much to this book that's not believable.
Yeah, like
Can I be here?
Oh yeah, you can be here.
Oh, a couple of points I want to make. When he first sent off the letter from the ship, the first stamps was about 1847, and this time was before 1847. So I was just wondering, how the mail services was set up during that time, and then how could, a letter, make its way to an acquaintance of his back east. But even after that, his descriptions of the Native Americans as he saw them, that seemed to be a description that a white man would give about another indigenous human, because it had that. It's like it was from the eyes of a white person. And I'm thinking that, if he hadn't encountered any Native Americans before then why would he describe them in sort of a derogatory type of description?
Exactly. Because even the natives that he called out, the names, those are not there. No Chickasaw out in that part in central Louisiana. You got the Coshada tribe. You have the Tunica Biloxi tribe that's out there. You have the Washita. That's who's out in that area. Those other tribes that he called out, they were never in central Louisiana.
So
that's why I said this is a propaganda piece. It is not an accurate description of there, because it's the Tunica people, they're still out there in Marksville. You still have the Tunica Biloxi tribe. They're still out there because they run the casino out in that part of the country. And then you have the Washita, which is out there up in Monroe, Louisiana. That's where they out in that area. And then the Coshada, which is coming down more going towards Shreveport, that part, they're out in that area. So that's why I said, this is a propaganda piece that they were put together. This is white people's doing.
Well, the part about the swamps, slaves eluded, fugitive slaves eluded capture by entering into the swamp areas because the dogs could not track them. And the bounty hunters or the slave patrols wouldn't go into the swamp areas. They had fear of, I guess rightly so. You got alligators, moccasins inside of the swamps, but that part is believable.
Yeah. Because anyone who does a demographics of that area would know they have a lot of wild hogs also up in that area. And you just wouldn't go into any swamp period with all those moccasins and all variations of snakes and alligators out there. You just taking a chance on your life, which is why Angola is built on an old plantation surrounded by a bayou. Because they know that if you escape the plantation, the bayou is there to the alligators. You're not going to get far.
I don't know. The swamp sounded about right to me. That didn't sound right to you guys? It really
sounded
didn't?
believable. That sounded believable.
Yeah, the swamp sounded really, really believable, especially the part about, we'll just accidentally pick up a water moccasin. That just sounded like along the river.
If you have trappers and traders out in that area and you would get information, they would be able to tell you exactly because they're out in that area and they would be able to give you an apt description of that part. So this Northrup guy, then plus he just up and disappeared. You don't even know where the heck this man ended up. His family, there's no tracing what happened to the family because he had 3 children according to the book. So what happened to his descendants? Where are they?
Well, I haven't seen the movie either. I'm a snob or a purist. I don't want anything to mess up my imagination. So.
But you would have thought a descendant or someone would be paraded on television to show, okay, these are the 5 times removed great grands of Solomon Northrup. Here they are. But we have
I understand.
With all of this stuff going on with this movie, they have not appeared.
I misunderstood. You're right.
I wouldn't be surprised if it was some white people came out and said, Solomon Northrup, that's my great-great-great-great-uncle. Twice removed, we went back and did the Ancestry.com and right here.
Mm-hmm. And we have people out by Alexandria, I'm sure.
Man, you should have never put that in the air. That's going to happen next week.
Well, they have the white Northrup because remember he said his father was given that name off of this lawyer who emancipated him, and those were the same people who allegedly he wrote the letter to that came to Marksville and got him. So there are white Northrups still, I'm sure, living in the northeast of the United States. But we're looking for the black ones, the people that actually descended from Solomon. Where are those three? He had 3 children. I'm sure they had other children. Where are those descendants? Why haven't we seen them on TV? Talking about, this is my great-great-great-grandfather.
That's a good point. I know they, in the book, and they had this at the end of the film too, that that there's a lot of mystery surrounding what happened to him, that he attempted to get some compensation against Birch and the white guys that sold him off, kidnapped him, and stole him, and that they were acquitted, a la what happened with Trayvon Martin's killer, but that they have no record of what happened to him afterwards. So yeah, that is a whole nother mystery with regards to white people and them either losing records and all this stuff as it relates to black people, and making it difficult for black people to be able to get that information to trace back to make sure that they know about their family and what their families have done, what their families have endured in this part of the world. Yeah, I would. Go ahead.
I have a question there. I want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly. After he was rescued, did he go back to work for this guy again?
It seems like he went to a different white racist plantation owner, Tanner, I believe was his name. Because he was making all the jokes when he first got there, like, "Oh, I've heard about you, nigger. I want to see you snatch my leg and throw me down, nigger." And ha ha ha, like he's making all these jokes when he first gets them. But it seems at some point he left, and so he, the guy Tibeats, the guy that he had the altercation with the first time, he was his master again. That he came back. I think he said Tanner had to leave and go someplace, and he wasn't going to be around. So Tibeats comes back and is working to him. That's how they have their second altercation. So it seems like he does end up having to work for him again, even though it seems like he's on a different white person's plantation at that point.
Oh, okay, yeah.
That's why I say that Tibeats guy is full white trash, because he moved from plantation to plantation. And I guess a lot of times he probably got fired because of his brutality towards the slaves.
Well, in our current parlance, when we just call him an unrefined racist.
I think even Mr. Northrup says he's ignorant, so he's in agreement. This is an ignorant white man that he keeps having all these altercations with. I've seen the film. I hadn't seen it last week, but I've seen the film now, and I did not enjoy the film at all. Like, I'm done with slave flicks. Like, this is, I couldn't think of any reason. Like, somebody said, "Well, hey, we have some non-white children. They want to go see this. Black children." And I couldn't think of anything positive with regards to why go see the movie. I'd be like, you should just read the book or do the audiobook or what have you. This I'm enjoying a bit more than the film, even with all of the white Jesus and religion and the positive portrayals of white people and good white masters, and it's a lot of that in the book. But even the passage, this guy's name is Tanner. I'm chuckling at some of his stuff, and I told people before, I think my sense of humor is a little warped. Snickering at things that are not funny or laughing at racist jokes, but the portion where Tanner puts Mr. Northrup in charge of reprimanding these slaves. He says that they're enslaved black people. He says that they're no good, nigger stealing, Sabbath breaking niggers. That's what he calls them. And he puts them in charge. The passage, he says, Warner, Will, and Major, according to Tanner's account of them, were melon stealing, Sabbath breaking niggers, and not approving of such wickedness. He felt it his duty to put them in the stocks. Handing me the key himself, Myers' mistress, Tanner, and the children entered the carriage and drove away to church at Cheneyville. When they were gone, the boys begged me to let them out. I felt sorry to see them sitting on the hot ground and remembered my own sufferings in the sun. Upon their promise to return to the stocks at any moment they were required to do so, I consented to release them. Grateful for the lenity shown them, and in order in some measure to repay it, they could do no less, of course, than pilot me to the melon patch. And I found that hilarious that they and this is another one that I would look at and be like, now maybe a white person wrote this. Like, white people, I think they like to slip in a lot of their little subtle racist humor, and that's all black people do is steal watermelons. But that's what they're in trouble in first place for stealing watermelons, and as soon as they get out, they go right back to the watermelon.
Surprised they got some fried chicken thrown up in there too.
Yeah.
Oh dear.
Man.
Oh dear.
You're right. I said the same thing. So I told my two sister-in-laws. I said I don't see nothing redeeming in this movie. I said let the children read the book rather than go to the movie, because you're not going to get the full gist of it. And I was hearing all these reviews about, I was in there and I was sobbing and I was crying. I didn't see nothing in that movie to cry about. The only thing that really bothers me is the last part where the young lady, I'm not even going to give it up, where she was whooped, where he was given the whip and told to beat her. That's the only part that messed me up, is how white people drag you into their madness by making you a part of it. No, they have to demonize you. Now, here's the whip. You need to go ahead and beat her.
Well, in my whiteness studies, I've found if you're thinking that might be an issue coming up, that you might be put in that position, the thing is to do something, is to be preemptive. Say, listen, I'm never going to be able to do your dirty work. As a matter of fact, I'm probably going to turn you in if you try it. And even if I get fired, I'm going to use my unemployment and vacation time to come back and testify against you. So you probably don't want to ever drag me into anything like that. But I am very aggressive because I just think that they respond, just like you were saying, they didn't get in trouble for the aggression. What people do, they respond better to aggression. It's when you treat them like human beings and you give them the benefit of the doubt, like taking a poison in. But if you just start off very aggressive, one-on-one, that seems to work better with them.
It seems to be working very well. I'm sorry.
I was through.
I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was agreeing. I was just going to say it seems to be working very well for Mr. Northrup. That's all I was going to say.
One other thing I'd like to say, when he was traveling and trying to make it back to the Ford plantation, and he ran, we was trying not to run into a white man that may ask him for a pass. Now, he was born a free man. It seems like he's picked up this system, about requiring a pass when you're traveling, if you're a slave and this and that. It seems like, I don't know if that would be out of the ordinary or not. Because if you was born free and you were in a different part of the United States and you wasn't required to have a pass, you didn't know about this system, then how would you learn that quickly if you were enslaved and then information was being withheld from you all of the time?
Well, how long has this enslavement been? Because has it been over a year? Because if it has been over a year, I'm sure the other seasoned enslaved blacks, they would have told him the do's and don'ts.
Well, he was
saying
that it had.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I think it was a year and 3 months. I could be incorrect, but from the time William Ford purchased him to the time he sold him off again, I think it was a year and 3 months. Am I think so.
Yeah, he would have been conditioned by then after the do's and don'ts of plantation life.
I looked up the conversion factor for his purchase price. It's $27,000.
Wow. It's pretty expensive.
I don't know. It doesn't sound that expensive to me. I mean, in 2008, in 1842 dollars, it's $1,000. What was it? $1,000 bucks, something like that. 1,400. It was $27,000 in $4.
It's still a good chunk of money.
Yeah, I don't know. One person. That's like more than some people get in a year. Like that's a year's salary for a lot of people. Like I don't know too many people. I mean, if you got a car that's $27,000, I don't know too many people that, I totaled my vehicle today. Like if you're gonna kill a slave, I totaled my vehicle today. No, I don't know too many people that would, be that aloof about losing $27,000.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, and he bought 3 slaves too. So can you imagine that? That's almost $100,000 on 3 people.
Yeah, quite wealthy. I guess. Yep, pretty wealthy.
That's probably why he went into debt, and he had to end up remortgaging those slaves to his brother or brother-in-law or whoever else he had to remortgage them to in order to get himself out of the bind that he fell into, because he probably over-leveraged himself when he went buying slaves.
Go ahead.
Did anyone else find it strange, or when he made it back to the plantation and the missus came to the door and she didn't recognize him? Here's somebody worth $27,000, and he obviously did not look like the other slave. He was educated, born free. He had to have a certain distinction about him, and she didn't recognize him.
They said we all look alike, and plus he said he was all scratched up and tore up looking from coming through the swamp. So she probably wouldn't recognize him at first.
It is a bit peculiar to have, if she didn't recognize him, to have some peculiar black slave stumble upon your doorstep and the white woman answers the door. Like that is, we see 2013 what happens when peculiar black people stroll on your doorstep of a white person's house. You have seen that over and over, what happens. So yeah, that is kind of an unusual moment. They did it. Am I missing that? Like all of that is not in the film. Like the second altercation with Tibeats and him escaping the second time, or I guess it seemed like when he started out, he didn't have it in mind just to go to Mr. Ford's plantation. It seemed like he was going to literally try to run away, but then all of that is omitted from the film. Is that accurate?
Yes, they skipped a lot. That's why I was saying the movie is not follow the script of the book. So you're better off reading the book rather than, because the movie is basically white supremacy. It's giving white people a good feeling. I could see that's why they're talking about Academy Awards and all of this nonsense, because it makes them feel good, especially when they threw in Brad Pitt.
He's like Jesus in there. Not that I want to dwell on it, but he is like Carpenter. He's got, anywho.
Gus, can you post that one for the other movie, the one that was did by Gordon Parks? Because I was doing a search and I couldn't find it. If you have, you said you had it saved. If you have a link where you can get it, because it's not in Netflix.
It's not really.
I went to Netflix and
It's on the Odyssey. I watched it from Netflix, I believe.
You did recently? You did
I'll
recently?
look again, but I watched it. I think that I got it off of Netflix.
The person who saw it, the person who told me about it said they watched it on Netflix.
I'll go back in there because I was on Netflix earlier this week and I did a search and they said no, it's not in there. But I know sometimes they put movies in and they take them out. But I'll do. You said it's called the Odyssey.
Yes, it's Odyssey.
Okay, I'll do another search again.
I guess before we wrap things up, one thing that did stick out when I watched the film, because I think they were talking about black people standing around and not doing anything to aid other victims of racism. And I think that's unfortunately been going on for a long time under the system of white supremacy where, I mean, everybody is being terrorized. You are being terrorized and you're unable to do anything about your own victimization, much less other folks being mistreated and abused, which is happening all the time. That is something that stood out. I did make note in just watching the film where a lot of these acts that were going down, enslaved black people being beaten or all the other things that happen and other victims being just in a very weak position to do anything about it. And I think that's still the case today. I think that's something that, I try to make sure that we don't abuse and get upset at other victims of racism and blame them for being in a weak position where they can't do anything. Frequently they are not in position to do anything to change circumstances or to aid other victims of racism. White people are to blame for that too, but that's about the only redemptive thing, and I didn't need to see the movie to get that. I can pick out plenty others. Even some of the excuses that I heard people giving, like, oh, we don't have enough slave movies. Like, there are more slave movies than you could probably watch. I've heard black people even tell jokes that they have done so many of these slave movies, whether it's older ones, whether you want to go back to Gone with the Wind or even Birth of a Nation or newer models, Roots. This Case Depart, that's a foreign one that came out within the last 2 years. It's Amistad. It's tons and tons and tons of these. We do not need any more slave flicks, in my opinion. We will be picking up, I guess, next week with Chapter 11. Before we conclude this week, just out of the folks that are on the line now, how many people think that this is not authentic, that this is just a story that white people cooked up for whatever? And this came out 8 years before the so-called Civil War. You just had, it's at the beginning of the book about Uncle Tom's Cabin. It came out the same time as Uncle Tom's Cabin, so you just had a pretty major work of fiction that's pretty similar to this. This is supposed to be like an authentic version of Uncle Tom's Cabin. How many people think this is an authentic story? This is real deal. Solomon Northrup told this to a white guy. The white guy did write it out, but this is real deal. He just wrote out what Mr. Northrup told him. How many people think that this is something that, white people just made up to sell some books and put out a good word or good image of positive white people, non-savage enslavers, where there were many good white people who were doing the right thing, even some many good white slave owners?
Made up.
I don't think it's total fiction.
I agree. I don't think it's total fiction also.
I think it was a competition for Uncle Tom's Cabin because it all came out around the same time.
But, I have the illustrated edition of the book, and I don't know, did the original book have any illustrations in it? Because they have pictures from Uncle Tom's Cabin in here.
I don't know if
it's been the same illustrators.
Hmm?
I don't know if the original book had illustrations. I have the ebook, and the ebook has illustrations in it too. It's not tons of. They tend to be at chapter breaks for the ebook, where it has illustrations of like the beating scene and some of the other stuff that happened. But I don't know if the original 1853 version had illustrations.
I'm sure they did, because that's how they hook you into these illustrations. And a lot of people made a living that way as illustration artists, making up these posters, and they do with the slave posters and the wanted posters and those things. So it probably did have some illustrations in them.
The only thing that I'm certain of at this point is that I'm confused about some of the things that have been taking place in the story. Like when you brought up how after he, went through the swamp and knocked on the door, like that just seemed, I was waiting for like some sort of moment after that, like something bad to happen to him, and it didn't. It was just kind of really calm. That confused me.
Yes, they probably took those parts out.
I'll do some checking to see about online link for Gordon Parks' version of this. I had the link for it, and then I couldn't find it. I don't know if they took it down or what have you, but I'll see if I can track it down again. Or if any of the folks that are listening, if you have a link for the Gordon Parks version, you can share, and I'll put it on my Facebook page, and I'll tweet it as well. But I'm pretty sure the person that told me about it, they said they watched it on Netflix, so I'll check there as well. I think it's either Solomon Northrup's Odyssey or the Odyssey of Solomon Northup, if you want to try either way in terms of the title search. And also keep that in mind if you think, this is something that white people just made up, if you think it's accurate, if you think they weaved in some truthful elements, some things that did happen. They did weave in some factual information alongside some fiction to concoct all of this. Kind of keep that in mind as we continue. I think we have about halfway to go in this story. Like I said, this book is not that long. We should be done either by the end of the month or the very first week in December. But it's not that long. We should be done. I think it's no more than 4 more sessions left to go. But we'll be back next week, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. The compensatory call-in, that should be tomorrow, 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central, and 6 p.m. Pacific. We'll catch up news reports from the last 7 days and observations, workplace racism. Good to hear from folks. Just tune in tomorrow and share views. Ted Wafer, I meant to say that yesterday. That's the name of the white man who has now been charged in the murder of Renisha McBride. They had not been giving out his name prior to, and definitely wanted to make sure that I got that out. Ted Wafer, that's his name, even though he's been named now since he's been charged. But we can catch up on that tomorrow. Thanks all for tuning in. Hope it was a constructive investment of your Friday evening. And having seen the film now, I would not recommend it to anyone. 12 Years a Slave, the movie. Not the Gordon Parks. The Gordon Parks, I do want to check that out. I'm a fan of his work. But the new version, I would not recommend it. No fan. It was not. I had several moments of pause just where the glowingly wonderful and genteel enslavers, white people, there were just too many of those moments, and then the coup de grace with Brad Pitt at the end, it was a lot to take. At any rate, anybody want to do the prayer to wrap things up?
I can do it.
Again, we'll be back tomorrow. Thanks all for tuning in. Invest if you think the program is constructive. Racism-notes.blogspot.com. Take it away, Mr. Demery 4.
Yes, Creator, we ask you today to enlighten our minds so that we may be able to discern the truth when we encounter racism and the tactics that white people use to confuse us. Clear our minds and help us to be patient with those who are still more confused. We ask as your sons and daughters. Ashe.
Ashe. Context of White Supremacy. Signing out. Thanks all for tuning in.
I'm a victim, brother.
No problem. You're a victim.
Man, I'm a victim of 400 years of conditioning.
Shut up.
The man has programmed my conditioning.
Mm-hmm.
Even my conditioning has been conditioned.